Good afternoon and welcome into the Senate Committee on Government Operations Committee meeting for Wednesday, April 2nd. We have two items up for consideration today. The first is H 474, an act relating to miscellaneous changes to election law. My plan is to have Representative Shay Waters Evans walk us through. She's the ranking member on our House counterpart, and just tell us a little bit about this. This is a 33-page bill. Ledge Counsel Tim Devlin has provided each of you on the committee with kind of a overview, which may shorten the process a little bit today in terms of walking through. But why don't we quickly go around and introduce ourselves? Well, I guess we all did, because we were together at one point.
That's right. We're all friends now.
And now we're not. So anyway, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm
Sure.
Shay Waters Evans. I'm from Charlotte. I represent Charlotte and a little bit of Heinsberg.
Okay.
As you said, I'm ranking member of House GovOps. And I was the bill reporter and did a lot of work on the miscellaneous election bill. I will not go. Tim is going to delight you with going through all 33 pages, but I'm going to look at his overview just to make sure I don't. I'm just going to do some highlights for you. In fact, and then
Sure.
So first I'm going to do the reports first. I'm not going to go section by section. There were two things that were in the original bill that turned into, they're not reports actually, my bad. Oh no, they are reports. They're not studies, not a study report. The two things were ranked choice voting and electronic ballot return. So those two items are now going to be, the Secretary of State's office is going to gather information on how to implement those programs, how much it's going to cost, what maybe, especially with the electronic voting, what some concerns might be with cybersecurity and stuff. And then they're going to report back to us. So January 15th, 2026 is the ranked choice voting report date, and November 15th, 2026 is the electronic ballot return. I just wanted to note for you that we currently do send people ballots electronically, but we don't accept them as returns. It's electronic voting. The goal for this would be to use them for overseas voters, people with disabilities or who otherwise can't get to the polls, to get them away to get their ballots back and to let them know most people vote as possible. And then, so those are the two reports. Going back to the beginning, well, it's not beginning. The big chunk here is what we call the second bite of the apple.
Yep.
Where if a candidate runs in a primary, they cannot run as an independent or for another party for the same election in the same election cycle for the same year. It's happened before. We had some testimony from a representative from Burlington who ended up running against the same person for both the primary and the general election. And, heard some testimony that it was a lot of time and money spent on something and confused voters, essentially. Mm-hmm. And I think our committee common goals are to not confuse voters and to let as many people vote as possible. So that was part of it. We had, there was a lot of back and forth when we were developing the bill. We had a couple amendments that we incorporated into its final form. So you might have seen some things that in our original bill that are no longer there. The other main question, there's some little things like we're going to ask candidates for demographic information. There was one section where we had originally asked for every candidate need to have a bank account, but now we wanted to remove all barriers possible to people running for office. We decided you only need to have a bank account information that you're disclosing once you are spending money on your campaign. So you can have it, you keep it under your mattress or whatever, but once you put it in the bank and you're spending it, then that information needs to be shared with the Secretary of State's office. Another major change, I would say major, in the bill is regarding write-in candidates. There was a lot of passion for write-in candidates and making sure that anyone who wants to be written in at the last minute has the ability to do so. It is highly unlikely. So it's really important to know that none of these write-in law changes apply to local elections. They only apply to House and Senate and above. So we felt like a good compromise. It was Secretary of State's office and the Town Clerks Association and a group of people were saying that a lot of times when a write-in candidate runs, there are people in the same town with the same name. Maybe they're relatives. It's Vermont. We're all kind of interconnected. Or the example I used in my floor report is that if your nickname's Cookie, but your real name is Jane, and some people have write in and they write Cookie Smith on their ballot, and then other people write Jane Smith, the town clerks and the BCA who's counting the votes doesn't know that's the same person. So what we're going to do is have candidates register as a write-in candidate. They have up until 7 p.m. on the day of the election. So like very last minute, you could have 6:59. You could be like, you know what, I'm gonna register as a write-in candidate. And then that'll alert the town clerks that and the BCA that they should look out for the following names. And so when you're kind of expected as a candidate in that way, then if there's a weird name misspelling or a nickname used or something like that, those votes can still count for the candidate for which they were intended.
So are you saying?
Was
that originally, I'm trying to recall.
Yeah.
You hear rumors through the building that it was 7 days old, then it was 10, now it's the same day as the election.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was
I wasn't noticing.
ideally it was going to be before to give the town clerks time to prepare, but there were some folks who really wanted to preserve that write-in vote tradition. So that was the compromise. We might need to do some work on it over here, maybe 11 pages. I don't know, but that's something that was still kind of being discussed.
Well, we each have our own view of it, but
That's right. And the Secretary of State's office has some opinion.
sure.
We don't want to make their lives harder, but so that is the write-in candidate registration. That was a big piece of it. And the only other part that's pretty major is if you might recall in Bennington, there was a House race that there were some ballots that were mixed up, not only in the 2024 election, but in 2022 and maybe some local elections in between. Is there were some after the 2020 census when we redistricted in the House, there was some confusion. So what we're asking the Secretary of State's office is going to cooperate with town clerks and municipalities, and they're going to any, like my district, for instance, I have part of Heinsberg, and I have one side of the road but not the other. So they're going to identify any districts that are similar to that or multi-town districts that have some boundary lines that could be construed as confusing, and just they're going to do, the town clerks are going to look and they're going to check their voter lists and they're going to make sure that everything is okay. And that's rather than auditing every single district in the whole state, but anyone that has like a questionable boundary line, they're going to check to make sure. They're going to cooperate with the Secretary of State's office to make sure that those are correct. And if there is a widespread problem, the plan is to reevaluate all of this. That's the only other major thing. We just committed when we decided, when we made the decision about who was going to hold that seat that was in question, that part of our deal of saying, okay, yes, we're going to seat this person, but also we're going to make sure that all the other voter lists are good before we get too much farther. So, and that's it. The only other thing I noted that may be of interest for you all is that we just had a bill come over from you all about open meeting law, and we were just talking about what constitutes a meeting, and the 474 designates what a meeting is not, and it is not voters gathering for annual or special municipal meeting. It's not what it is. Just a little fun fact. Yeah.
Was there anything about fusion candidates in the bill as introduced?
There sure was.
Okay.
Yeah,
But it didn't make it to the finish line.
it did not.
Okay.
That was, yes, we were going to prevent people from running as fusion candidates and just ask them to pick a party. There were some other things that were in the bill too that ended up coming in, but
Okay.
that was one of them.
Questions for Shay?
Shay, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Maybe lunch, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, but I'm always sorry, Mr.
Thank you very much. You did an excellent job.
Thank you so much.
doing that, and
You did it
we'll begin
fast.
to dig in.
Yeah, well, I didn't
Oh,
go
I'm
through the
sorry.
whole bill. It's a Tim.
Senator Bielanski.
Yeah.
What was the committee vote on this?
So
The committee, oh my gosh, Okay, hold on. I think it was 7-4. Oh, no, it was 11-0.
And what was the floor vote?
Probably voice vote.
It was a big spell. Okay.
Wow, and it was a unanimous vote?
No,
Senator Clarkson?
So it was pulled
oh,
back.
actually, it might have been, sorry.
I guess it was a unanimous.
Yeah, I think it was.
This bill, as I recall, did it get pulled back in the committee?
Wait, that's,
The one you're talking about, H474. Didn't it?
we had a couple amendments. There were several amendments that, neither amendment ended up, there were two that were about the same thing. One was, asking to move the independent filing date past the primary filing date
Right.
in order to give independent candidates like kind of the ability to look and see who won the primaries and then decide whether or not to file. It was the first amendment that dealt with that issue was I asked for it to be 10 days after the primary election. The second asked for it to be, I think, 6 days after the primary election. Neither was acceptable from a timing point of view from the Secretary of State's office. And the presenter of the amendment withdrew it both times. And then there was another one that ended up being what we have here. It got incorporated into our bill. It was presented by several representatives.
Thank you.
All set? Thank you, Shay.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Nice to be in here. I'll see you again soon. Or other bill.
Oh, I'm sure you will.
Thanks.
Again, I don't know whether it's easier for Tim to walk through this as a 33-page document or a 6-page document with citations therein, but welcome. And this is our first look at H474 as passed by the House. So Shay did a great job kind of hitting the highlights, but I think it's probably our job now to dig in a little bit. So I don't know if we want to go. You have part 1, part 2, but you also have section numbers. Okay, so does this cover all the sections in the bill?
It does.
Okay. So we're at your mercy in terms of which way you want to do this.
Sure. For the record, Tim Devlin, Legislative Council, thank you very much for having me today. And it would make sense maybe to start with the overview, just kind of go very high up, very broad strokes, and then kind of just get a short, pithy explanation of what each section does as they're grouped by parts, which the parts are really a reference to the reader assistance headings, those kind of asterisk elements in the bill. And then whenever there's need or want or question about any particular language, we can maybe dive into the bill language itself, and I'll kind of keep track of exactly where I'm between, so I can give folks page numbers and assist in navigating things.
Great. Sounds like a plan.
So let's see, from the bill overview, and this is an overview of Bill 474 as passed by the House. It's being shorthand referenced as the Elections Miscellaneous Bill. Taking it very high, just the first bulleted points in the overview, the purpose of the bill. And this will act as the most summary of summaries here we have. This bill proposes to require the Secretary of State to report on the feasibility of permanently instituting ranked choice voting for presidential primary elections. It will require the Secretary of State to report on the feasibility of permitting electronic ballot returns for voters who are ill, injured, or have a disability, voters who are military overseas voters, as well as voters who participate in the Secretary of State's address confidentiality program.
Can you explain that? I know I should know, but I don't. What the Secretary of State's address confidentiality program is?
I don't have the best handle on exactly who qualifies for that program, but
Who's it?
It's from the confidentiality reference, but I didn't know if there was a specific statute or definition somewhere.
I'm sure it's in statute.
Okay. We don't need to delay your testimony.
As it's just the program is referenced itself,
Yeah.
just by name, in the relevant section, we don't make a cross reference to it, but I can certainly provide those if wanted. This bill will also.
I guess, may I just follow up on your, it's just like, well, you don't have to. Why should they be protected any more than anybody else? I mean, I don't really understand why they would have an opportunity for an electronic return as opposed to anybody else.
That's
probably
probably
a
a policy decision that the committee made.
Indeed, this certainly calls for determination. And I would reserve, maybe questions for, the Secretary of State's office to provide you with exactly what the reasoning is behind those, policy recommendations. This bill will also enable candidates to voluntarily provide additional demographic information. It will require write-in candidates to file with either clerks or the Secretary of State by the close of polls in order to have their votes counted. There's a typo in there, and it will also increase the minimum thresholds for write-in candidates in primary elections. This bill will also make various modifications to campaign finance reporting requirements. Certainly get more detail about those later on. And it will require town clerks and boards of civil authority to perform audits of the voter checklist for representative districts and senatorial districts that serve municipal boundaries. In the event of a contested election and recount, it will require candidates to nominate disinterested parties to a recount committee and prohibit the Superior Court from appointing nominees to recount committee. Sorry, excuse me, I'm correcting a typo. Let me restate that. In the event of a contested election and recount, this will require candidates to nominate disinterested parties to a recount committee and prohibit the Superior Court from appointing nominees to the recount committee if they're an interested party. We'll get into exactly what that means a little bit later. In the event of a contested, then it repeats itself there. I'll clean up this outline for next time. And finally, it will modify various state and local election procedures, of which, when we get to this part of the bill, I will turn it over to my colleague, Attorney Anderson, to provide additional detail there. So starting with part one of the bill, which is really just section one, this is session law. That will require the Secretary of State to submit a written report on or before January 15th to 2026 to the House and Senate Committees on Government Operations regarding the feasibility and associated costs of permanently instituted ranked choice voting for presidential primary elections in the state. And that's just a written report. Any questions on that before? I just want to make a quick note that sections 2 and 3 of the bill, this state deleted, what they were, and doesn't really matter much now, but just so you know, those sections pertain to the failure of a major political party to nominate a candidate for a primary, but that has been removed from the bill. Part 2 of the bill has to do with one bite candidacy. This is sections 4 and 5 in the bill. Section 4 will create a new subsection 17 VSA 2381. Reading, in no event shall a candidate who loses a major party primary be nominated to appear on a general election ballot pursuant to this subchapter by a committee of any other party than that party for which the candidate appeared on the primary ballot. So, in essence, if you lose a primary, you can't join the team of another party. Section 5 addresses the independent aspect of this. So section 5 will create a new subsection G in 17 VSA 2401. It's the language to mirror that which is found in section 4, stating the candidate who loses a major party primary for any office shall not appear on the general election ballot as an independent candidate for the same office for which the candidate lost in the primary election. So, yes, Senator Clark.
Could they still be written in?
Let's see. These restrictions are just who may appear on the ballot. So, yes. Okay. Let's see. Part 3 of the bill pertains to the electronic ballot returns report and miscellaneous changes to electronic ballot delivery law. Section 6 is session law that requires the Secretary of State to report on or before November 15th, 2026 on the feasibility of permitting electronic ballot return for voters who are again ill, injured, have a disability, military overseas voters, and voters who participate in the Secretary of State's address confidentiality program. And just like to reiterate the point raised by Representative Waters Evans about the existing law already permits the transmission of electronic ballots to the voter. However, the return of those is not allowed via electronic means. Section 7 amends 17 VSA 2539, that is the delivery of early absentee ballots, creating a definition for overseas voter as, quote, a person who was last domiciled in Vermont before leaving the United States and resides outside the United States. Will also enable voters who participate in the Secretary of State's address confidentiality program to receive their ballots electronically. Currently, those individuals cannot, but overseas voters and voters who are ill or injured
Makes more sense.
or have a disability can currently.
So,
So that makes more sense on the receiving end rather than returning it for those.
It's also a report on returning.
correct. I guess my question would have to do with last domicile and then the verb resides. And to me, they are, I don't say the same thing. In other words, I've lived in Vermont for a year, but I moved to England and reside there. I would still be eligible to vote in the United States. Is that what this is saying?
But that happens all the time.
Yes, to answer your question.
Okay.
Presuming that domicile implying that you do intend to return here.
Right.
Someday, and you're otherwise eligible to vote, cast a vote in Vermont. Part of the residency requirement is intended to or continue to live
Right.
here, and it's treated as temporary aberration
Okay.
of residency.
Thank you.
Part 4 of the bill pertains to candidate demographic information. This is section 8 of the bill. And this will amend 17 VSA 2665, notification to the Secretary of State. And this is about the context of local elections, town meetings, and local elections in general. This amendment will enable the collection of demographic information that is voluntarily provided by candidates running for local offices, excluding school boards, specifically with name, gender, age, or race or ethnicity. Notably, it adds an exemption to the Public Records Act that makes this demographic information confidential, except that the Secretary of State publishes data in aggregate form. So again, voluntarily provided, not necessitated to list your name on the ballot. And if proffered, that information would be not just exempt from Public Records Act, but actually deemed confidential, which is a step further. So when it goes beyond the custodian of records being voluntarily, despite there being exception.
This is only a local election.
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
I-
I don't get, I mean, what,
Well, we can,
was this requested of the Secretary of State?
Um,
What is-
I can't speak to that, whether one wants to. But I can say, like really any other policy decisions, the scope of this can be adjusted by this committee and however they see fit.
Do you know what the point of this? Do you know why this was?
I can speak to what it does, but not really exactly why it was advocated for.
Do we know who advocated for it?
As a committee bill, I don't know. We
Okay.
came in.
Well,
Nice try, though. You did it 3 or 4 different ways, but
Okay.
I don't want to put Tim on the spot. He's not
But
here.
for questions like that, Representative Waters Evans may be able to provide you additional information.
It seems as though I can remember in the last general election, the Secretary of State, and again, it wasn't a local, I'm talking about senatorial and House of Representatives races. There was something that was, I don't know if it was published, but it was certainly online, that gave people information about each of the candidates.
I'm glad the Secretary of State created their own.
Yeah,
voter
and,
file.
and I'm
Voter-
not sure that there was authority to do that at the time. I'm just making that as sort of a statement. I didn't choose to participate in it. So mine came up empty, but there were others that used it and,
So,
but I always thought, and if I'm not mistaken, it came with the ballot.
no, it was on their website.
No, I think I got a QR code in my ballot that allowed you to go on and read about, in essence, all the other candidates.
Oh, actually, it's a QR code.
I just thought that was. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
I think it's an effort of the Secretary of State
I understand that. I'm just,
to educate voters about who they're voting.
understand all that too. I just didn't know where the authority to do that came from.
Got it.
Okay.
Next part of the bill has to do with write-in candidate registration and minimum thresholds in primary elections. In sections 9 and 12. These sections can kind of be read together to do the same thing. Essentially, there's a lot of replication here for the various types of elections we're dealing with. So primaries, generals, and then presidentials as well. So some of the language is repeated in 3 different areas. So, but together, they will require a write-in candidate for the General Assembly or any state office or any federal office to register, that is by filing a form separate from the consent form, not later than 7 p.m. on the day of election. That is the close of polls, that is. These sections will also include an exception to this filing requirement so that a write-in candidate who qualifies, so that a write-in candidate qualifies as a winner if the candidate otherwise received the most votes. So starting off in the place of you need to register by close of polls if your write-in votes counted, except for the fact if you actually are that write-in candidate, you win without doing that, you still qualify as a winner. Section 9 in particular will amend 17 VSA 2370 with write-in candidates. Title 17 is under nominations and primary elections for context. Adding a new subsection A, which accomplishes that above. Should also note that it will create a 2B designated section B that will increase the threshold for write-in candidate to win a primary election. So that the write-in candidate must receive the same number of votes as the number of signatures required for the candidate's office on a primary petition.
So.
I can anticipate your question, but please go ahead and discuss this.
No, this is great. So write-in candidate would have to have 50 write-ins or
The
100
same
write-ins.
as whatever.
Yeah. That's great.
So in our world, it's 100
Yeah.
and in the House, it's 50.
That's right.
It used to be 25 and 50. All right.
Current
Say,
statute.
this hasn't passed yet. It currently is 25 and 50.
Mean for write-ins.
Yes.
This
write-in-
is, I think this is great. Oh, man, I disagree.
Okay.
Wonderful. Terrible. To win the Senate race on only 25 write-ins, that's a
No,
joke.
50. We have to get 50 right now.
I still think that's a joke.
Okay.
You're representing.
All right.
that.
But we're just
Anyway.
walking through the bill.
Eh,
Again, there's an exception to this, except if write-in candidates receive more votes than a candidate whose name is printed on the ballot, that write-in candidate wins. But regardless if they didn't quite get that threshold for petition makers. Section 10 will amend 17 VSA 2472, this is the content of balance, to require that the write-in candidate file a consenting candidacy form. And that's actually, I'll update that because it's no longer a consenting candidacy form, it's a distinguished form from that. And again, we have that deadline of 7 p.m. the day of the election. And just a quick note, this section is amended twice at 2 different places throughout the bill. Section 11 will amend 17 VSA 2587, the rules for counting votes. And this is kind of the mechanics behind how to count those write-ins and the requirements they have to have, apart from the deadline that's stated in those other 3 sections, including the following this. In brief, a voter or a write-in candidate in an election for General Assembly, state office, or federal office that is not registered by the close of polls, the vote shall be counted as, quote, other write-ins. The election officials counting the bills and tallying results shall only list the names and votes received of registered write-in candidates. Any write-in votes for candidates who have not consented, again, I should say, file a form to the write-in to write-in candidacy shall be listed again as write-ins. And then section,
What under this construct of the law happens if a write-in candidate doesn't emerge until after the primary because something's happened? Say a sheriff has been arrested for assaulting someone, or a candidate that had run and won the primary has died. They can't run as a write-in. There's just a dead person on the ballot or someone who's assaulted someone on the ballot with no ability to challenge that by write-in.
so if there's a write-in for the primary, or sorry, I should say, the primary has concluded, the winner is, let's just say, disqualified for some reason or another. This individuals may still file as a write-in for the general election. Following, there's no prohibition on that. There's just a timeline that accompanies that. So by the 7 p.m. of the general election day, they'd have to file with the Secretary of State that they're
Okay.
founding a write-in candidate.
So the way that this is constructed is for the specific election. So a primary write-in candidate has to be filed by the end of the primary,
Yes.
any general election candidate. Now, if
And
the
then-
primary candidate. Okay,
It's
Actually-
a triplicate essentially,
Okay.
just because the way that we constructed our statutes, there's a different chapter essentially for primaries, a different chapter for general elections, different chapter for presidential elections. So we have to state the same thing 3 different places. If
Okay.
we want it to be uniform across each election.
Okay.
yeah, no, it significantly reduces one of my concerns with that section now that I understand that it applies to the election separately. So thank
Okay.
you.
So just for clarity, if a candidate doesn't register by 7 p.m. on election day, that candidate could receive 12,000 votes. But they won't, I mean, maybe not, but as a write-in, but it wouldn't be counted as that person. It would just go in as other write-ins.
Unless they won, in which case they would still qualify as well. Yeah.
Okay.
So
So
if they didn't,
that seems like a loophole without
Yeah,
having to
exactly.
register.
so if they didn't win, then essentially the clerks would be spared a certain labor by having to
Well, they're still gonna have to count them if there's the possibility that they could have won.
and
Okay. I was just trying to, did you have a question or?
Well, I can just, I'm a vice with League of the Clerks Association. That was to reduce the burden because there are certain races that have gone by where there's been no legitimate
Maybe,
race or no legitimate write-in person. The feeling was is if you are a legitimate write-in candidate and you come in and fill it out, it just, they're looking for the name. Or they might say, some people call me BC, some people call me Brian. It kind of says like, look for all these names and it helps their counting process. And it's important to note that I keep forgetting about is if there's ever a vacant seat, all write-ins are counted.
okay.
If that makes sense. Like if no one's running in your house district, every write-in is counted.
I just want to make sure that I understood the trigger was to register as a write-in by 7 o'clock on election day. And if you
Yeah.
didn't, in essence, unless you win, your votes aren't counted. Or they're counted as other write-ins.
right,
Okay,
and indeed it would be a reduction of certain efforts that clerks would have to go through with tallying.
yeah, and I fully understand the intent. If I were a town clerk, I'd get pretty tired of counting Mickey Mouse and then having to continue to count Mickey Mouse. So I understand the intent. But now it looks like I made you,
Well, yeah, I mean, no, I understand the intent. I just don't see how it actually decreases the workload, because if there's a possibility that a non-registered candidate could win, the clerk still has to count it to see if they won.
And as I understand the mechanics,
I agree.
there are matters of tallying and counting, and then I believe secondary process of kind of notating for the Secretary of State's registration records, I should say, exactly who each of those write-in candidates were versus just noting just X number of write-in candidates. And perhaps this is a question of on-the-ground experience, best luck to
Yeah.
our Secretary of State's office. I do, what that looks like.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
See how it saves time and effort is what I would like to see. I don't see us saving anything here.
Well, we can hear from the clerks.
Just limiting.
And finally, section 12 in this grouping of sections will amend 17 PSA 2702 nominating petition for presidential primaries. And will require, this is just particular to the presidential race there. So part 6 of the bill.
Oh, sorry.
It's existing law that being nominated for president comes with a filing fee.
Yes, I think that
It's
is,
$2,000. I see it in there. I just also see it's not underlined, so it's existing law.
yes. Oh, it is, yep, it is line 15 of, so this is page 9. Yes, that's already in there, not slated to be modified. That unaltered text is left in there to provide, contact with the case.
Mhm. Okay.
The next part of the bill has to do with finance. This is sections 13 through 17. And together they remove various monetary thresholds. So that instead of surpassing a certain dollar amount, like $500 in expenditures or contributions, all candidates are to register with the Secretary of State with the necessary financial information, regardless of any money that's received or spent. That is further caveat here. By section 13 in particular, will require that candidates need only to file their banking and treasury information with the Secretary of State's office at the time of expending funds or making expenditures. And then 14 would capture that general amendment and then also add to it that candidates need only file campaign reports to the Secretary of State if the candidate makes an expenditure.
So nobody else.
My understanding, and I certainly will hear from the Secretary of State, is that, so last year we did some campaign finance stuff where we put in some penalties if you don't file.
Mhm.
We discovered that that was unenforceable because not everyone has to file. As far as I read it, this doesn't solve that problem because still not everyone has to file.
Just can't spend any money.
That's right.
Right, but how do we know you didn't spend any money or you didn't just not file the
Exactly.
Like that's the problem now is
This
when
is not
people
solved.
don't file, the Secretary of State's office doesn't know if the reason they didn't file is because they didn't spend money or they just didn't file and should be fined. And this does not solve that problem.
Senator White.
Thank you, and I apologize for the delay. Sounds like you guys have gotten into it already with the election stuff. Can I just say, but wouldn't it just be so obvious that the person bought a lawn sign versus like, hasn't the thing been that they're like, oh, well, I didn't spend that amount of money versus if you have a lawn sign, if you have driven a mile to go door to door, like, I mean, there's no way you wouldn't, like, is there a way you could have not spent money and have people not know? Like any money, like I feel like it's,
Yes, I think you could.
I'll give you an example in the House race, not so much in the Senate
Yeah.
race, but in a House race, if you are an incumbent, you probably saved your signs
yeah.
from the election prior.
Oh,
So you could have a garage full of signs and then not have to file this time because you're technically not spending any money. You're just putting an old sign back out. I
yes,
think.
yes, and I think that actually makes the point that she's making, which is you wouldn't be able to know then. So I do think maybe everyone does need to file.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, if they don't have to file the whole report, they would have to attest that they spent, so like take some sort of definitive action so that the Secretary of State can look and say, these people didn't do anything and therefore are in violation.
We could certainly amend this for sure. It'd probably be a little harder if somebody was on the air, on TV. Those aren't given to you. You have to spend money to do that. And so the lawn sign might be an example, or what do they call those things? Palm cards,
Yeah.
where you've already
Printed a
purchased them
bunch.
and you may not need to spend money to do it.
Yeah, I had to file twice a month. I had to file twice a month as a senator.
At the end of the election.
We all did.
We all
Yeah.
did.
We all did, Larry.
Yeah, twice a
It's like
month.
a given.
My treasurer did it for me. Did it. I gave him all the figures, what I spent and everything.
But that's the same for anybody that's in a general.
It felt like I wanted to do it right, so I did it right.
But I think Senator Bielanski raises a a good point. That without, some sort of verification, you really never, although, I mean, I just find it hard to believe if you're gonna run, you sort of, you raise money and you spend it. I mean, that's the way most, you don't raise it and then sit on it and hope you win it.
Exactly, and I think the public needs to know who you're raising money from, even if you're independent, and I think you should be filing everything.
Yes.
Well, we do have a rather, my view, extensive campaign finance situation. Just saying.
I just think we have to take
Okay.
the additional step to make everyone use it.
All right.
Yeah, and
Good
that
point.
everybody doesn't equal, that everyone isn't filing is really, yes.
Okay.
So, let's see, section 15 will amend 17 VSA, section 29.1, there's the definitions. There are a few different things in the definition section. We'll remove the definition for independent expenditure on a political committee. We will modify the definition of political committee / political action committee to, from any two individuals to any one person that accepts contribution of $1,000 or more, makes expenditures of $1,000 or more in a 2-year general election cycle for the purposes of supporting or opposing one of our candidates, influencing an election, or advocating position in public question in any election. And we will create a definition for the term public question campaign to be, quote, a political campaign, specifically an effort to influence an election that conducts its activities entirely independent of candidates, does not give contributions to candidates, political committees, or political parties, does not make any quote related campaign expenditures as defined in section 2044B of this title, and is not closely related to a political party or to a political committee that makes contributions to candidates or makes related expenditures. A political question campaign includes any campaign of different expenditures that defined by 25 or 52 U.S. Code, section 30101. And then we have two additional sections here that one, section 16, will essentially replace two uses of independent expenditure on the political committee with that new public question campaign reference. That's in 17 VSA 2971, reports and mass media activities. And then section 17 will then repeal section 17, 2970, campaign reports, other entities, public questions, with modifications to the definition of political committee, which has its own reporting requirements under 17 VSA 2964. 2970 is now superfluous.
So is getting rid of the independent expenditure only political committee supposed to basically just be then replaced by a public question campaign definition? Is it just supposed to be cleaning those two up?
I would say some parts of it can fall into public questions, but not all races are about public questions, of course. But with the expansion, or I should say modification to what is a political committee, a political action committee, the two individuals to one, it would also capture some of the campaigning activity that would be in support of candidates running for independent that would fall under the old definition of independent expenditure on the political committees. So yes, Senator Fox.
Okay. So this all seems so muddy. I don't know why.
Yeah, what
It
does
just
it
seems very muddy to me today.
Yeah, I was trying my best to understand
I don't
what
understand.
the landscape is now and what this
What does this
changes.
even address? I don't, does this mean like, we're gonna have a proposal 3 to amend the Constitution? Is that what this is trying to get at? Is the money raised to help promote, market a public question, like a proposal to amend the Constitution? Is that what this is about?
Certainly would capture that, the public question campaign definition, yes, and add some specificity, I think, to the various type of campaigning activities that occur. So they could be more
Really,
easily
none of that
identified.
seems very clear here. What they can, I don't know why I made it too many words, but it just seems so unclear. Anyway. well,
I guess we-
those will-
What is the problem they were trying to solve? In that?
Yes, thank you.
That I cannot attest to.
Oh, okay. Darn.
I wonder if this is actually getting at a problem that we forgot to solve in our electronic media bill that was raised on the floor, that the way the language was crafted in statute only applied to actual candidates, not public questions like ballot initiatives. And I actually think that's what they're trying to solve here. We did it in a different way, but there's a couple spots in this bill where I actually see that if they're answering a question we also had just differently than we answered it.
Okay.
I apologize. Did you guys have the bill reporter come in? Did
Yeah,
they
yes.
come
She
in?
did. She did.
Okay, okay.
So
Maybe.
we can have her back.
Because I think that makes sense, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I
but
know.
that's how I,
So-
well, I mean, we've had this happen a few times where we solve something and it gets solved differently and then it makes a mess.
Okay.
But this is trying to get at
I think so.
public
Maybe it's
questions
chance.
Yeah.
on the ballot that are not candidates.
Well, it includes
What's-
candidates too, though.
Does,
It does say. General election cycle for the purpose of supporting or opposing one or more candidates.
Right, but the public question campaign definition on its own explicitly says that it conducts its activities entirely independent of candidates, does not give contributions to candidates, political committees, or political parties. So it
Right.
really is, it's a ballot initiative or a,
right.
Yeah.
Fisher.
but we also, this got raised in, like I said, in the AI bill, and we just solved it differently.
Okay.
So an independent expenditure only committee, what was that? Is there an example of that in Vermont that we've seen? Because I don't want to just name people, but I'm thinking like the Let's Build Homes people.
I mean, there
You know,
was a
like
job called eviction campaign in Burlington and Winooski.
But that wasn't, I guess it's not on a question. Did you have a thing on
They
your
were on,
ballot?
yeah, they were on the, they were
But
for
what,
charter changes.
this could also be, it's not on the ballot. Is this what it is now? This could be just
So-
a general political campaign for, like, it could be like Rutland Forward could technically be.
Traditionally,
Or,
the term independent expenditure only political committee is the longer version of like a super PAC.
oh,
The idea of something that, there should not, there's a prohibition generally about coordinating with established campaigns, and that would affect campaign finance as far as who can accept what amounts of definitions, because as you may recall, after Citizens United, there was basically blown right open, no limitations to be placed on campaign expenditures. However, that case still preserved campaign contribution limitations,
Yeah.
as well as other things like reporting, things like that. So if we have a limitation on how much a campaign A can get, essentially they can only get so much, but if they have, say, $1,000, but they can spend how much they want, but really they're limited just to how much they have. So traditionally, independent expenditure, a political committee, because they're independently organized and operated and not supposed to be coordinating with that, they have different thresholds for how much they could accept.
Yes.
And then they could do the spending that the candidate may not want to, assuming that their interests are aligned.
so this is now, that still exists. You can still do that, but it's now under the definition of a political committee.
Well, political committee is worded, sorry, I'm trying to exactly recall, what the modifications were here, the principles here,
You still can have super PACs.
well, you can still have political committees and political action committees, can be now one versus two people, and, sorry, I'm trying to skip through the definitions here.
Because
Right, so, and again, yeah, they essentially, there's some redundancy in definitions here because, those political committees or political activities, the PACs, can be supporting or opposing candidates and really be kind of listed out here, influencing an election, advocating on position, public question there, either way, and let's see, that's just the definition. I'd have to check in other
Okay.
statutory sections exactly what the contribution limitations
Yeah.
are, but,
I guess I would just say, if we're getting rid of super PACs, yes, I am fully on board. We should 100% get rid of them. I don't believe that's what this is doing. I believe it's just cleaning up
I think
the
so.
language and
Yes.
the definition of those things.
I don't-
But I would be super pro if we could do that.
I will say you can't.
Oh,
Under the constitutional,
that whole Citizens Be United thing.
That little problem with federal law.
Well,
So-
I have thoughts, but I'll keep them off the record.
So here's my
Why?
suggestion. Why don't we have Shay come back in and talk to us about why they put section 15 in? What's the problem they're trying to solve? And help us, because I think it is a little muddy.
And actually, I think there are a bunch of intention questions we have raised during the course of this review, which would be really helpful.
Yeah, we don't want to
To
force
have-
you.
Or somebody else from that committee.
No, Shay would be great.
I think it is just.
Give me the section number.
Part 6, section 15.
And actually, we had a couple on
Yeah,
other
we did.
sections.
I don't remember what they were now.
So Jillian, let's keep a running list because we also had questions about the intentionality. Tanya, we had questions about the intentionality of some of these other questions.
I'm
Jay, too.
keeping notes in my draft.
Okay, so Jillian is gonna be emailing her, so let's just make sure we do this. Okay,
They did some work over there.
Yeah.
well,
So, and, feel like I can look into some things and maybe get back to Alfonso.
That would be great. Thank you.
So let's see, part 7 of the bill has to do with the auditor of voter the audit of voter checklists and district boundaries. And section 18 is session law that requires town clerks and boards of civil authority on before August 15th, 2025 to perform audits of voter checklists for representative districts and senatorial districts and split municipal boundaries. On or before September 15th, 2025, each town clerk must provide a written summary of the audit to the elections division of the Secretary of State's office. On or before 15th, 2025, the Secretary shall submit a written report. The findings of the audit, that is. This one.
have we ever required an audit of this before?
Yeah.
I just fundamentally, this gut feels bad.
I have a big note here about voter purges. It feels really bad to me too, and I know why it's being done, but
Wait, can we?
It's
We
not
do
urgent.
this.
It is routine maintenance of voter
Yeah.
checklists.
Yeah, we do.
have
This
in
is
the
our,
law.
this is our list. This is what we do this every year, right? We do this in Hartford where we call the people who have passed away every few years in a big room. All the Board of Civil Authority comes
So
and we
this
go,
is
oh,
standard.
they died.
So this is standard?
This is
It feels
not to be a
not good.
regular audit of voter checklists. No, the audit is more of a.
Audit may be a bad word. How about cleanup?
This is, let's see, yeah.
Response to the
It might be
vetting.
a legal
Yeah,
word,
exactly. It is in response to the vetting.
Uh,
One issue where there was a district that was split municipality along one street and one of its parts of its boundaries. And people were erroneously listed on the incorrect checklist. And so following that as they, confused the ballots weren't sent to the right people for the right district. This would be taking a look at the town clerks and boards of civil authority initially. Take a look at those districts that split municipal boundaries to make sure that those everybody who's in the boundary is on the checklist, and then any names on the checklist that shouldn't be in the boundary, that's made note of. And then in turn reported to written summary of that, can include details of mayors if they want, to the elections division, who then turns around and submits a written report and synthesizing all those various reports they receive from the local level to the legislature.
Senator Yoski.
Do you have a sense of how many of the districts we're talking about? At least Hartford.
I do not know.
Okay.
Well, that's a good question.
More so in the House, obviously.
Like I know my Senate district qualifies in this space, but I'm just wondering how many, what are the numbers we're talking about?
I believe the Secretary of State's office does have a number.
Cool.
I don't know.
I will wait to hear from the Secretary of State then.
What's concerning about this is this is not the first year of a redistricting. This is the second election of a redistricting. Why was there such a problem?
Apparently,
Second
it's also
time.
not the first time this problem has happened.
Right.
Since we've redistricted, it's just the first time that it might have mattered.
Oh, okay.
Senator White.
Personally, I'm not feeling great about this section and I would want us to spend some
Yeah.
time on
Oh,
it.
yeah.
I especially think that from my understanding, At least this is what we do in Hartford, and we used to be 4-2, 4-1, and now we're a whole different district, but we go into we go into the auditorium and you go to there's two different spaces. But we as a Board of Civil Authority, we review both sets of voter checklists, and we do that. So it feels like we kind of already do this in the case for split districts already. So this would be for every split district, not just newly split districts.
Sure.
Is that correct?
Right, any qualifying district where it splits a municipal boundary or differs, I guess.
Yeah, but we already do this for most. It's not like the split districts aren't doing it now. They are doing it now. At least in Hartford, which has a split district, we are doing that now. So this we would have to do in addition to that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that makes me a little concerned. I don't love that section.
Not loving it either.
Tucker Anderson, Legislative Council. I just wanted to build on what Senator White was bringing up, but the routine purging and review of those mostly based on whether someone has maintained residency in the municipality, and may not be a detailed look at whether even for the past election or past two elections, they have been on the wrong voter checklist because of an error, a mapping-based error, where in the example of Bennington 1, the boundary line went down the middle of the street. So it was difficult for the officers reviewing the checklist to determine based on the address whether the voters were listed on the wrong checklist. That is the specific issue that is being examined here.
Okay.
And it is maybe a more granular check-in than the 90 days before the election routine purging to check residency status, or whether someone has, for example, died since the last election and should no longer be on the checklist.
I can see the confusion it might cause for a poll worker. If somebody is at 2 Main Street, someone else is at 3 Main Street, it seems like it's the same street, but they may in fact be across the street from one another and therefore in a different,
And
If only someone had argued back in 2021 that this was a confusing way to redistrict.
there's perhaps an original sin there too, where the checklist originally was incorrect. And what the local BCAs are doing is checking those who have been on the checklist since reapportionment to see whether they have maintained their residency, and not necessarily checking to see if there was an error in where they were originally placed.
And this is what this would do.
Yes.
Okay.
okay, let's push along because we do have, well, we got half an hour.
So part A of the bill, which is just one section, section 19, has to do with the prohibition of, let's see, appointment of interested parties to a recount committee. And this will amend 17 VSA 2602A, that is appointment of recount committee. So that in the event of the county election and recount, candidates are to nominate disinterested parties to a recount committee. Though it would also prohibit a superior court from appointing nominees to a recount committee if they are an interested party. Disinterested individual is defined as an individual who is not a relative of or subordinate to the candidates and who shares no direct pecuniary, monetary, interest with the candidates.
So is that a question?
The definition still seems somewhat vague to me, in that you could make the argument that anyone voting in that district has a monetary interest because this candidate may or may not raise my taxes, or like it seems like.
And perhaps monetary is too different term from pecuniary. This would capture things, and I refer to my colleague, Terry Anderson here, things like business partnerships.
Yeah.
Would be another-
Okay, so it can't be my family, they can't work for me, they can't be in a business partnership with me. Right, seems reasonable.
They can't share a source of essentially revenue or income.
Right.
And the term direct is included that they can't have a direct pecuniary interest with the candidate.
Right.
And it's perhaps pecuniary was chosen specifically to capture more than just direct business or financial relationships, but also things like common property ownership interests, where you're receiving a benefit that is of value, but isn't necessarily strictly that monetary value. And this definition is cribbed a bit from trust law And it's really targeting at, do you have a legal or consanguinity?
Jeez,
I think that's right.
what, I don't even know what
Of the
procurement.
blood, consanguinity of the blood.
Of the blood or legal relationship with the candidate?
That's how I use that with,
Or do you have, essentially, if we're boiling it down, a financial interest that you share with this person?
no, I
Could you
think
go back to
it's a
what
good- it's a
procurement
good choice.
Yeah.
Pecuniary,
Pecuniary. Pecuniary.
That is indeed that financial.
that's that, what you just said. It's financial.
Actually, I think it's a good choice. And I think it's clear.
Uh-huh, great.
And there's no disinterested definition right now, so if someone wants to get on a recount committee, they just can get on the recount committee. This sort of tightens up.
Yeah.
Right,
They can be interested.
They could
There's
be
no
very,
prohibition
All right,
on the
okay.
interested party.
which sadly.
But you just have to have an
we need
equal number
I
of,
think that,
yeah.
Yeah,
right, nomination process, if you can.
So, oh,
include your-
okay.
Appreciate the definition. Because the sort of common word understanding of the definition of interested, I'm like, wouldn't everyone be interested in the outcome of the election?
exactly.
So I appreciate this.
Put it away.
Yeah, I just had a question. So I went through a recount for my select board race. Does this also cover municipal races or is this just state and senate?
Great question. So
Yeah,
where are we?
just to be clear, I won by some amount of votes.
I,
First
I'm not in
read,
the local election chapter, so.
because it was interesting because it was like my librarian from childhood was there, the parent of an ex-boyfriend was on the recount. I mean, like, it was a mixed group of people. And they made me bring a witness. I had to have someone with me or someone in the room the whole time. So my mom and I traded off shifts. It took many hours.
So for local elections, I will kick it over to Tucker, who will be up later, so making those come back to.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess my only question would be, does this affect local elections?
It should affect all.
Because I think it's, yeah, I feel like it kind of should. It does.
I agree.
Because I do, luckily everyone seemed to have good intent.
You had a recount and you won by 700 votes.
7,
Oh, seven.
Those are very different
Yeah.
numbers.
I was gonna say 700. Why did anybody bother? But
Yeah.
7,
it's a good afternoon.
that beats South Royalton's. Or Royalton's.
I know.
The Royalton's 100 one.
Sarah Buxton. Okay, I apologize for that.
That's okay. So part 9?
Part 9 has to do with deadline modifications and miscellaneous clarifications. This is a grouping of sections 20 through 28. And so I'll just kind of run through these pretty quickly. Unless,
You haven't gotten there yet, but I actually do have a question about the first bit
the first bit,
of
section.
casting more than one ballot. Am I on a different spot?
You're in a
No,
different.
you're there.
That is where I was.
To make
Section
explicit that
20.
voters may not vote in multiple jurisdictions.
Yes.
Okay.
Can't vote in Burlington, then vote.
No, I
Southborough.
understand, but my question is on the definition of territory and how it might impact dual nationals who in fact are allowed to vote in the election of both countries that they hold citizenship.
But we are overseeing the election of wherever they vote additionally.
But if their municipality, I am curious how this could impact dual
Would
nationals.
read territory as US territory here.
Okay,
But I can think a little.
and maybe it doesn't. I just want to make sure that we aren't creating state law that makes it so dual nationals in the state of Vermont can't vote.
But we can't control their vote elsewhere. And we should not be able to.
I want to make sure that this language doesn't purport that we're going to.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
Section 21 will repeal 17 VSA 1973, which is now redundant with 71, its expanded definition. 22, section 22 will amend 17 VSA 2103 to modify the definition of campaign to mean any organized or coordinated activity undertaken by one or more persons instead of two, which is currently the statute. Section 23 amends 17 VSA, section 2358, the examining petitions and supplementary petitions, to allow election officers to return defective petitions and signatures to a candidate within 2 business days from the receipt. It's currently 72 hours. Section 24 will amend 17 VSA 2413, that's 13, As the filing of the certificate of organization. This is chapter 35, political parties.
Senator Miofsky.
Sorry, I'm going backwards. We are potentially lengthening the amount of time that the officer can return the petition. So if it's filed on a Friday, they now would have until the subsequent Wednesday to get back. But we are not in any way extending the amount of time that the person has to collect those signatures. So in essence, we may be shortening the amount of window they have to cure the petition. Because it just says 10 days, it doesn't say 10 business days or 10 days after receipt of. Okay.
Says two.
Well, so I'm looking at how it impacts existing law. So the 2 business days versus 72 hours could in certain instances, and actually would, because most petitions are due on a Friday. It would extend the amount of time that a faulty petition goes back to the person significantly, but we don't on the other end extend the amount of time they have to cure the petition. That is my flag here, as we actually didn't change the corresponding, but that's, thank you.
Let's see, section 25 will amend 17 VSA 2413. Nomination of justices of the peace. And what did I? Nope, I skipped a section. Sorry. Section 24 will amend 17 VSA 2313 with the filing of certificate of organization. As in chapter 45 for political parties, requiring party chairs and secretaries to file digital records when filing a certificate of organization. Section 25 will amend 17 VSA 2413, that is nomination of justices of peace, by inserting a deadline of the 3rd Monday in July before each primary election for town party members to nominate candidates for justice of the peace. Section 26 amends 17 VSA, section 2493, that is the use of the vote tabulators in audits, by removing the requirements that post-election audits, the vote tabulators be random. Still required to have audits, just no longer random. Section 97.
It's another question for our House counterpart.
Big question.
Yep,
Really? Just target areas?
yep.
That's bad.
Mhm.
We think. Let's check.
Section 27 will amend 17 VSA, section 2546. That is the receipt of ballots by clerk, voter status, and opportunity to cure, processing, and absentee ballots. And this is in chapter 51, that is the conduct of elections. And this amendment will permit town clerks to begin processing mail-in ballots 45 days before the election day instead of 30 days. Section 28 will amend 17 VSA 2703. That's examining petitions, supplementary petitions, to allow election officers to return effective petition signatures in a presidential primary to a candidate within 2 business days from receipt instead of 72 hours. It's similar to the provisions in section 25. Okay. And now we get to the part of the bill, sections 29 through 36, which pertain to local elections. So I will substitute myself for Attorney Anderson. Okay.
Here I am, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. For the record, I did add a pin to my lapel just before this meeting, just because I couldn't let Tim show me up. He's
No.
wearing pins all the time.
I know.
just had to make sure that I had one as well.
Did you add the Cabot cheese one that we all
Yeah,
got today?
did you see
I
that?
did not. This was in fact a special thing that was produced by the clerk of the House.
Oh,
So, yes.
We will see in 20 minutes.
Indeed.
correct.
I wanted to start by backtracking to the question that Senator White asked about whether the recount requirements would also cover local elections. The answer is no, not immediately, and that's because recounts for purposes of contested elections at the local level are governed by 17 VSA chapter 55, and those are the local election statutes, and the recounts are performed by the Board of Civil Authority.
Yeah.
And the Board of Civil Authority is granted discretionary authority to appoint other election officials who can assist in the recount. But the term that is used in that statute is that they must be impartial election officers to assist the BCA. There is an opportunity for an appeal based on the recount to the Superior Court. And eventually you can get down to the point where all of the recount procedures are governed by the section of law covering statewide elections. And if you'd like a map of all the various cross references that happen there, I can give it to you. Because in the statewide recount chapter, there is immediately a subsection that says that the procedures for local elections shall be governed by 17 USH 55.
Okay.
Subchapter 3, but who can?
Wow.
remember
But I might
those
have to go
procedures? Exactly.
Wow. Well, thank you for that information. It explains the diversity of people who were at my local recount. And what, yeah, that just makes me think why we wouldn't do that for. But that's.
We should do it.
It's a policy choice
Yeah.
for the committee if you want this to
Good.
extend.
It's a good thing
to
it's in this committee. We can add.
those discretionary officers.
Thank you for that information. And I don't need all the cross, although Allison might, based on her.
Why need cross references when you have Tucker? Sure. It's a duplicative effort.
Boy. Section 29 proposes an amendment to the open meeting law. It amends two definitions for purposes of the open meeting law. Both the definition of meeting and the definition of public body. Meeting is amended to clarify that a gathering of voters for the purposes of an annual meeting is not a meeting governed by the open meeting law. Further, and this is belts, suspenders, and anything else that could be secured here. Public body is amended to state that the voters of a municipality in the annual or special meeting are also not a public body that would be governed by the open meeting law. Good.
Is that the long list of that follow after the cannabis piece?
No, that's.
That's all Bill in.
Yeah.
Yep, that's just in that piece. And to clarify, just based on this committee's work on S59, this
Yeah.
wouldn't extend to the annual representative town meetings because those are not gatherings of the voters. That's a meeting of representatives elected by the voters to conduct the annual meeting. So separate ordinance. Section 30, this is the first of a few instances of amendment where the term present and is struck. So you see the term of art present in voting throughout multiple sections of Title 17, Title 24. Apparently there's confusion practically out in the world about whether this would eliminate the ability to vote by mail.
Oh,
So in order to avoid confusion, there are a few instances where present and is struck.
Okay.
good then.
Yes, anyway.
I mean, I disagree with that would mean that, but it's probably a good idea for us to do that because this will eliminate folks claiming that. Perhaps is that kind of the goal?
The goal, as I understand it, is to eliminate confusion for elections officials.
Okay.
Who are administering this. When you do a more fulsome walkthrough of this bill, it may be a good idea to investigate whether there are any unintended consequences from altering an established term of art for purposes of election law. Or whether this could perhaps more easily be addressed through some direct communications to municipal clerks.
Okay.
Bring on the clerks.
Section 31. This is the first instance of an amendment that is proposed twice within the local election sections, clarifying that a municipal vote on a subject is valid until it is rescinded by the voters. So there are a few instances where this was not expressly stated. For purposes of Section 31, this attaches that language to the decision to hold an informational hearing that precedes the annual meeting of the municipality. So if you vote to hold those informational hearings, that vote is valid until it is rescinded by the voters. Section see, this is still in the same section, but in 2642, 17 VSA 2642, there's language added to subdivision D that clarifies that a lead petitioner for a petition has been submitted has the authority to withdraw the petition in its entirety prior to it being entered on the ballot. This language is being added in order to clarify that a petition can in fact be withdrawn, because right now the ability to withdraw from a petition is just the ability to withdraw your support as a signer. You can withdraw your support of the petition, but the petition itself, once submitted, cannot be withdrawn.
Okay.
This language allows the petition to be withdrawn by the individual who is the lead petitioner.
Yes, Senator White.
So with the main reason for this, it kind of seems like, I assume there's not a lot of people who go through all the effort of doing a petition and go, never mind, I changed my mind. But select boards can add things to their ballot. Is this more that angle where maybe I've been working on a petition, I've submitted it, and then I submit it and the select board goes, wow, this is going to be a ballot question. Maybe we want to reword it or do something. Is that trying to resolve for that situation, or are people doing a lot of petitions and need to withdraw?
I can't explain the motive
Okay.
for why this is here or what the policy, discussion was around this, but what you pointed out could absolutely be employed here, particularly with things like charter amendments, where if it's petitioned, the words that are chosen for the proposed charter amendment are locked in place. The legislative body has no authority to change the petition's language. And in that case, maybe it would be an instance where the legislative body decides to go with the language, but wants to be able to amend it and you withdraw the petition.
Well, this is helpful because we have a little bit of a situation at times where people say, I'm working on a petition, I'm gonna get it in, and the select board goes, well, actually, we might add something to the ballot. And if that person could say, I'll withdraw it if you add it to the ballot, that feels like it might.
Okay.
So thank you, that's a good, I hadn't thought of that.
The next proposed amendment in this section is for the charter amendment procedure in section 2645. And this amends subdivision A6A. And the proposal here is to separate the notice and warning requirements for the actual vote on the charter amendment, and then have a separate notice requirement for the hearings. Right now, they cross-reference the same statute, and this was being interpreted to essentially require 30 days before the hearings and then 30 days before the vote, with 10 days in between. So a 70-day timeline for some of the wordings and notice here. And this would collapse that down to 50.
Oh.
Section 2651A. This is a proposed amendment to the statute that allows municipalities to switch to the appointment of constables. And under current law, if there is a written protest to the proposal to appoint constables, the municipality is required to carry a 2/3 vote to shift to the appointment of constables. This removes that requirement. And there's also a present in voting shift in there as well. Section 2651D, E, and F all contain the same proposed amendment, which is to eliminate the requirement for just cause and a hearing for the removal of appointed officers, specifically the collector of delinquent taxes, the municipal clerk, and the municipal treasurer. So it would allow removal at will. Furthermore, it adds language that limits the appointment term to 1 year to make it express that this is not just cause when you are appointed to this, and it is not an enduring appointment. You must be reappointed annually.
Okay, I get. So our delinquent tax collector is our town manager. It's just like an assigned thing that they get, that they're the
Part of
person.
their duties.
It's part of their job. So now they have to every year come before the select board and say, I would like to continue to be the tax collector, versus when they became the town manager, they work for it.
Let's investigate some of the town manager statutes, because there might be interaction there where these appointment statutes would no longer come into play. Because these are applying to a separate officer who
Okay,
is elected until the town votes to have that be an appointed position.
Okay.
It's applicable to all municipalities, right? So this is incorporative of those that
may
don't
not
use
have that.
the town manager system.
Interesting, okay.
So anything else?
Can we just go back to constables for a minute? How many towns have constables and what is the job of a constable?
That is a fantastic question. I'm not certain we have the time to dig into all of the details around constables. There was a proposal, and I do believe it passed, to allow municipalities to eliminate the office of constable.
Yes.
And over time, let's say 10 or 15 years, Senator Clarkson, there's been a diminishment of the duties of town constables over time. Largely because there's no requirement for the election of those officers that they actually be certified law enforcement officers.
Which is what
So-
bad, whatever.
A lot of statute was amended to clarify just what law enforcement duties are even allowed to be assigned to town constables. So I can send you the statute that refers to the duties that they are permitted to have.
We expanded those.
Yes, but it's contingent on approval of the municipality before they can exercise any of those law enforcement powers. And as far as data on just how many municipalities are still successfully electing constables or appointing, that's probably find you, and the VLCT may be able, they may already have that data available.
Greenville State did a whole episode of what is a constable.
I appreciate that. And the flag that I have for it though, is that my understanding is that it can have some law enforcement capacity and
Yes, we've encouraged them to get training.
well, I have some concerns about this and I think that we don't need to do it now because I know we're short on time and doing a walkthrough, but I actually think I might want to dig a little bit deeper into the constables.
Happy
Okay.
to assist. Moving through some of this, we'll jump into section 32. This amends 17 VSA chapter 55 subchapter 3. The first proposed set of amendments is in 17 VSA section 2680, which you are all familiar with from Act 1 of this year. This is the Australian ballot system in local elections. And the proposed amendment is in subdivision H1, and it establishes a presumption that unless it is otherwise specified in state law, an informational hearing is not required just because the Australian ballot system is called for a specific purpose. So the cannabis section, this is a similar, this will also have some interplay there. So if it says you have to vote, for example, to approve cannabis retail establishments within your municipality, and
Yes.
you have to vote by Australian ballot, but it doesn't have a clause that says and hold an informational meeting.
You still do.
This is going to say that you do not have to hold that informational hearing on that question. This is language that you might want to take a look at just to clean up subdivision H1, because the entire structure around this clause sets up a different presumption, which is that every time you hold a vote by Australian ballot, you must hold an informational hearing.
We
Yeah,
do that.
we're right up against it.
Oh, okay. Let's keep moving.
Section 2681 is amended, and this condenses the timeline between the submission of a nomination for a municipal officer and the actual election to the fifth Monday preceding the day of the election. This eliminates 1 week of time. And when you get into this, there's background about why it's being collapsed on one end. It is certainly going to make the administration of that election a little more difficult for the town clerk. But this was raised as an issue because if it is further than that, especially for special elections, you are effectively requiring 6 weeks before you can hold the election, because you have to have that amount of time before the election for the candidates to submit nominations. So it allows more time for candidates to submit nominations, less time before the election, but also allows, for purposes of a special election, the municipality to do things a little faster if they need to.
But also less time to do voter outreach with known candidates.
That's for primary.
Less informed voters doesn't seem like a good idea
It's
to me.
just, this is for local elections.
But lots of special elections aren't with candidates. They're
Section 33 is relatively quick, and this amends 20 VSA section 2485 to clarify that for purposes of fire districts, voters are the ones who are voting. Somehow the term voter was not used thoroughly throughout that section, so this is a little bit of cleanup. Section 34, this is going to amend the subchapter that deals with vacancies in town offices. The First Amendment in section 961 clarifies that this procedure covers elected officers, so it adds the term elected before municipal officers. There was some confusion as to whether these procedures came into play for appointed officers who move out of the town, resign, or die while in office. We can jump into section 963. This allows the legislative body to fill a vacancy or to warn for the annual meeting, the election to fill a vacancy if the vacancy occurs within 90 days of that annual meeting. So it allows for a longer timeline for the election to fill a vacancy if it falls within 90 days of the annual meeting. You can hold it at the end. Okay. Last few sections here, section 35. This clarifies that the section 24 BSA, section 1529, dealing with the first constable acting as the collector of taxes. That this section is triggered for appointed or elected officers. And in section 1936A, we have another one of those clauses that clarifies that a vote under this section to prohibit constables from exercising law enforcement authority is valid until rescinded by a vote of the voters.
Okay. Yes, that would be helpful.
Could we, the General Assembly, simply prohibit constables from exercising law enforcement authority? Would that be within the purview of things we would be allowed to do?
It's a great question and one that has been investigated by some super excellent attorneys in our office in the past.
Yes, I think that you're
and
looking at
that
one of them right now.
Deserves a more thorough and.
I guess we're coming back to constables.
Suppose so.
Thank you.
Okay, part 11 is the effective date.
Way to go.
So,
Yeah, with a minute to
right on
spare.
time, want to welcome in, well, a familiar face to me, two familiar faces, actually. Do you have a particular order in which you would like to
One of you guys
proceed?
belongs to one of you.
We love to have you do it together.
So we can sit at the end of the table together.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. John Bloomberg for the record. My belief is I kind of was discussed with you about this bill, maybe that you should have some testimony, some background from parliamentarians and those individuals that maybe involve staffing of the various ethics channels. And so I went out, I'm more than willing to give a couple of words at the end, but I went out on the very most qualified person I could find for you to give you some testimony and some background on the policy procedures, constitutional issues. And the clerk of the House decided she would come along to provide that presentation. So I would think it's best to have her go first, and then maybe, I don't expect there to be any need for cleanup, but maybe I'll give you 30 seconds at the end.
Sure.
Oh, so you're going first is what I heard.
It's nice to have two expertises in one person.
Yeah.
So Betsy Ann, if you'd like to join us. And
I think
for
it's
those of you
worst
that-
first, best last.
Yeah. No.
Betsy was
Oh, we love the
a
girl.
very familiar face to this committee. Before she became clerk of the House, she was a legislative counsel with special attention to government operations. So she and I have known each other for all of my 11 years, and it's great to see you. And I know you're gonna help us negotiate through, we're looking at H1,
Yeah.
the act relating to accepting and referring complaints to the or by the State Ethics Commission. And I know you have a handout. We heard from Professor Peter Teachout in person last week and then by email providing written testimony. And we kind of chewed it up in terms of the judicial system yesterday. And so this is Betsy Ann's bailiwick, if you will. Oh, my goodness. 20 pages.
We got a lot of.
Peter was her professor.
Do you know everybody here? You may or may not. I certainly know, you know, some of the, but Larry Hart is.
Have you met Larry yet?
I have met some.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
So welcome and love to hear what you have to say.
That is excellent, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be back in this room.
We love having you back.
I love being here. And thank you to the secretary also for allowing me to be here. For the record, my name is Betsy Ann Rusk and I'm clerk of the house. And I am here in my role as clerk to discuss with you H1, House Bill 1, because I believe it corrects an infringement on constitutional legislative authority that is set to take effect on September 1st of this year, pursuant to last year's ethics bill, which was H875, and which once enacted became 2024 Act 171. I'm also here in my role as co-counsel to the House Ethics Panel. On my panel co-counsel, Deputy Chief Counsel Michael O'Grady is the legislative counselor who I believe is handling H1. And Michael and I discovered during 2024 adjournment that the provisions of 2024 Act 171 appear to us to infringe upon constitutional legislative authority and therefore violate separation of powers. And members of the 2023-24 House Ethics Panel agreed, and that's why House Bill 1 is introduced. And the provisions of H1 that impact the House Ethics Panel in the same way impact the Senate Ethics Panel. And so I'm happy to be here with my Senate counterpart, the Senate Secretary, and I believe we share those concerns raised by the 2024 Act. But chamber committees and panels are only agents of the chambers themselves. They're just under the chamber's separate constitutional umbrellas. And so the provisions of law that you are reviewing in House Bill 1 that apply to the House and Senate ethics panels ultimately relate to each chamber's constitutional legislative authority. So I'm happy to be here to discuss with you the constitutional legislative authority and procedure, which are the legislative powers at issue in House Bill 1, because those are the focuses of my legal practice now as clerk. But I'm also here to provide you with some background and context. For those of you who don't know me well, before I was elected clerk at the beginning of the 2021-22 biennium, from 2010 to 2020, I was an attorney in the Office of Legislative Counsel handling government operations. So this committee and your House counterpart were my home base for that decade. And in that role, my legal practice included providing advice and guidance on Vermont state governmental structure, including separation of powers. And it was in that legislative council role that I drafted the 2014 House resolution that created the first House ethics panel. And Michael O'Grady and I have been staffing that panel together since it was created. It was also in my leg council role that I drafted legislation to create the state's first ethics commission. I started drafting those bills in 2015 and the commission was finally enacted in 2017.
We did that together in my first year.
And I handled legislation and provided legal advice on the scope of the authority of the commission, including as it related to other entities in state government for both the government operations committees and for members until I was elected clerk in 2021. And since I've been clerk, I continue to handle these legal, policy, and procedural issues regarding House member conduct and House member ethics in my role as clerk and panel co-counsel. And so I've been following House Bill 1 with interest and with some concern in regard to some of the testimony that has been provided to the two GovOps committees to date about what H1 does, about what current law says, and about the scope of constitutional legislative authority. And so I provided you with a memo today regarding issues that H1 attempts to address and why we in legislative staff believe H1 is necessary to correct the constitutional issue created by last year's ethics bill. So before I get into the memo, just for context, last year's ethics bill H 875 was introduced by the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs, and the House considered it for the first time on March 29, 2024, as we were careening toward adjournment of the biennium. And as you may have already heard from Michael O'Grady, neither the House Ethics Panel nor its staff were ever asked to weigh in on the bill's procedures or provisions that directly impact the panel. And if we were, we could have been having this conversation last year instead of coming to you this year. That's why we're here now. If you remember, the Senate didn't pass the bill H 875 last year until the very last day of the regular session. You passed it with proposal of amendment, House took it up on rule suspension, and it got concurred in that day on the last day of session. It was a very fast process.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know what the debate was like in the Senate. I know in the House, on the floor, the testimony was really focused on the new provisions relating to municipal ethics.
Yeah.
Right. But the bill had a lot of other things happening that relate to state ethics as well, including the impacts on the two chambers ethics panels. And we didn't understand or realize this new consultation requirement was in the bill until after the legislature adjourned. And so that's why we're here now. Right. But we believe that H1 can correct that issue and still provide the intent of the bill with a constitutionally sound alternative to have the same spirit and intent prior to this language taking effect on September 1 this year. So, Mr. Chair, with that background, may I please share screen so we can review this memo together?
Please do.
Awesome. Thank you to Julie, for providing me with the link. And if I can get technology to cooperate with me, Mr. Chair, I will pull this up. Is it on your page already, Jillian?
The memo?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's on there.
Whoa, that's
That makes it
awesome.
easy. for
You
her.
are so good.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you for emailing it as well.
Yeah, awesome. I'm just gonna pull it up quickly here. Pardon my delay, Mr. Chair.
That's okay.
I know you run a tight ship. And I saw that you ended your last agenda item directly on the dot of 3 o'clock.
Well,
Yeah.
that doesn't happen every day, but I do try to stay timely.
I know you do. That's awesome. Okay, here we go.
I think Rep, he's the chair.
How did you
slash
do
rep.
this? Yeah, you the rest.
We haven't had any cards issued yet.
Cards issue.
No yellow cards.
That's soccer. Well, that,
Ah.
ice hockey doesn't have cards.
No, which soccer does, so I mean, you know, it's.
I think you could be, somebody should put in the penalty box.
Yeah.
Who are you taking your penalty box, Secretary Blumer?
I got an extra gavel on what to bring for him.
So, you know, John, I think that's a great cabaret act.
Oh,
Ooh, what a goodie box.
Yeah. So just to start out, again, your committee is considering H1. The purpose of this memo is to provide additional context regarding why the House Ethics Panel and its staff perceive H1 to be necessary in order to correct an infringement on constitutional legislative authority and procedure created by the enactment of the 2024 Act 171, which was H 875, Section 9. So what was happening in that section? That Section 9 amended 3 VSA 1223, which provides the procedure by which the Vermont State Ethics Commission, which I'll just call Commission, accepts and refers complaints regarding governmental ethics in any of the 3 branches of state government. Under that statutory law, which existed prior to last year's act, when the commission receives a complaint, it refers the complaint to the applicable state regulatory entity that ordinarily handles the complaint based on the complaint context. So to confirm, in the legislative branch, the commission refers complaints regarding representatives to the House Ethics Panel and to senators to the Senate Ethics Panel. In the judicial branch, as you've already heard, the commission refers complaints regarding judicial officers to the Judicial Conduct Board and complaints about attorneys to the Professional Responsibility Board. And these are the regulatory entities that are the arms/agents of the state constitutional entities that have authority over these individuals. In accordance with the exclusive authority of the House and Senate to judge member qualifications and the Supreme Court's exclusive authority to have disciplinary authority concerning all judicial officers and attorneys in the state, as set forth in our Constitution. So what that section 9 did was add a new subsection C to provide a consultation requirement when the commission refers a complaint to the applicable state regulatory entity. The new consultation requirement is not yet in effect. It's going to take effect, it's set to take effect on September 1st of this year. The new subsection C purports to require each regulatory entity to consult in writing with the commission regarding the application of the state code of ethics on any complaint the commission refers to their applicable regulatory entity before the entity can make a final determination on the complaint, which means by statute, either closing the complaint without further investigation or issuing findings following an investigation. And I cite there in footnote 3 where that comes from. And I also just note something I discovered just today in the act, in a separate place in the ethics law, in contravention to both legislative panels, in footnote 4, confidentiality requirements, because both panels have confidentiality requirements. And you heard from the judicial branch that they also have confidentiality requirements. The commission, with these written consultations, have the statutory authority to make these entities' written consultations public if the commission pursued its own investigation of the complaint and it resulted in commission discipline. Just discovered that today. So that's an extra layer of concern because we all have confidentiality requirements. So the bill is introduced this year. H1 was sponsored by the members of the 2023-2024 House Ethics Panel who are returning to the House. We lost one, it came to the green room, in order to address the separation of powers concerns regarding this new consultation requirement. These concerns were only realized after adjournment of the biennium because neither the panel or its staff, as I said, were consulted on these new requirements prior to bill enactment, despite the provisions impacting panel processes. So H1 passed the House with amended language that includes the applicable judicial branch regulatory entities, since the legislative and judicial branches have similar constitutional regulatory authority. And the bill is limited to the manner in which the consultation is required. When the commission refers a complaint to the applicable regulatory entity in the legislative and judicial branches due to the constitutional authority of those two separate branches. Specifically, H1 would require the commission to provide in advance any application of the state code of ethics to the complaint when it refers to the complaint and a recommended action in order to avoid the 2024 Act's attempt to control by statute the constitutional authorities of the legislative and judicial branches to regulate the individuals described in the Constitution, because statute can't control the Constitution. By H1 requiring the commission to provide the consultation upfront when it refers any complaint to the relevant legislative panels and judicial boards, rather than requiring those entities to consult with the commission before they can make a final determination, as currently required by the Act, it will address the constitutional concern explained in testimony by the legal counsel for these entities that the upcoming law, if it's not amended, attempts to control those entities before they can act on a complaint that's within their constitutional purview. Under H1, with this information in advance, for the House, at least, I can only speak for the House. The House Ethics Panel can then consider the application of the State Code of Ethics, and the panels need to further consult with the Commission. So what this memorandum does is describe the legislative powers impacted by last year's Section 9 and relatedly the judicial powers. It'll also provide an overview of the State Ethics Commission and the current processes shared between the Commission and the House Ethics Panel.
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
So what I would say,
because this is where I've been struggling. I think I've said this to every single witness. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really know what we're talking about when we're parsing it out, but it seems like the main section it's like subsection A, B, and C is really what folks are concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
And you aren't in favor of those sections.
Of H1?
Yes.
I'm definitely suggesting, and I'm supporting H1 to correct
The entirety of it.
Entirety of H1.
Okay. And that is in disagreement, that is not in disagreement with our council. That is an agreement with our
It's
council.
an agreement with Mike O'Grady,
Yeah.
not with Peter Teachout.
Okay, that is really helpful because Professor Teachout I really did not fully understand the argument he was making. But the consultation piece that you're describing, just because I want to make sure I understand before we get too far. The difference between what you're saying and what he's saying is you're saying it's fine that you give the information before you make a decision? Or is that kind of
Thank you. I'm glad.
every time I'm like trying to understand?
No, it's good. So last year's ethics bill provided a new consultation requirement to say that whenever the commission refers a complaint to a legislative or judicial entity, that legislative or judicial entity, which means for us, it means the House or Senate ethics panel, has to consult in writing with the commission before the ethics panel, the legislative ethics panel, to make a final determination on the complaint. And big picture, what we're saying is that raises constitutional concerns because it's statute attempting to control the constitutional authority of the panels to judge member qualifications and attempting to control their legislative procedure.
Okay, so, and this makes it so that you still have consultation.
Yes.
You still have, so you're saying, okay, this makes sense.
They refer, but there's no consultation after they've referred the case to us.
Unless they want to.
Unless the ethics panel chooses to consult with the ethics commission, they could absolutely. do
Yes.
that.
Yeah, that's great.
There's no requirement to.
In the new bill.
There isn't currently, but there would become a requirement on September
September,
1st
yes.
because of work we did last year. This is correcting the mistake we made.
We haven't
last
even
year.
made the mistake yet.
Well, we made it, but it hasn't gone into effect yet.
We made it, which is why we're spending so much time trying to fix it.
And sorry, Senator. I just wanted to say, just to follow, what H1 would do is say, instead, to fix this issue, when the commission refers a complaint to the legislative panels, it just provides the info up front about any application of the state ethics code to the complaint. So then the panels can then consider that information. And then, like Senator Clarkson was saying, the panels can determine whether they need to have further consultation with the ethics commission about the application of the code.
Great. And that is, the reason is because you don't necessarily, like the House Ethics Commission doesn't necessarily get the case. It can come from the funnel of the Ethics Commission. So you wouldn't in H1 need to give them any information unless it came through them giving you that information.
When they refer a complaint, we accept complaints from the commission, the ethics panel accepts complaints from the commission, and then our ethics panel goes through its own investigative process if it deems it's necessary. And then we do report back to the commission on the final disposition of the complaint.
Okay.
What last year's bill said, when the commission refers a complaint to the ethics panel, legislative ethics panel, we can't take action on making a final determination until we consult in writing with them. But what we're saying, just give us the information on the state code of ethics up front to alleviate these constitutional concerns about statute attempting control, legislative procedure over a constitutional authority to judge member qualifications, and just to administer legislative procedure.
And the point, okay, I think I'm getting there. And the point Professor Teachout was making was that even with this, he still thinks it's a separation of powers issue. Is that,
I wouldn't characterize it that way.
then I keep trying to understand the point. Thank you. Continue.
Summarize it.
I think I'm just gonna drop the concern and.
Well, Peter, would you be willing to, in lay language, summarize Peter's concerns so that you can compare the two?
So this is very odd for me because Professor Teachout was my constitutional law professor. The first time I've ever said that I don't agree with all of the statements.
I've always agreed with Peter, and this is a first.
This is the fifth.
I know, and you're witnesses to that.
So I don't agree with his analysis, his stated analysis of what the current law says and the application of this new consultation requirement. And multiple other things in this.
Okay. Well, that's really helpful because okay, great. Sorry to interrupt.
Right, and just to clarify, ethics complaints can come from a number of sources. Yes, the Ethics Commission is one funnel, and it is the most public funnel through which the public can make complaints.
But they could go direct.
But if it's an internal complaint, it can be done internally. If it's so there are other ways a complaint could come to the ethics panel.
Senator Bielski.
To Senator Clarkson's point, under the current act that we're talking about, if a complaint came in not through the Ethics Commission, say from another, is there still the requirement for consultation?
If the complaint came
From another source came to, so say I made a complaint to the Ethics Commission that I thought Senator Clarkson did something
The panel or the commission?
unethical. The panel.
To the panel.
Oh, directly to your Senate Ethics Panel, then it's all handled through your Senate Ethics Panel.
So even under the current law, if we didn't fix this, there's not then a requirement that I take that to the Ethics Commission.
Correct.
But the ethics panel might respect so much the expertise in the ethics commission that they might.
That they could consult.
There is always the option that if a panel wants to consult with the ethics commission, they may.
According to what we met in our first ethics upstairs, we have to, if there is a complaint from you, for instance, then we have to interview you, then we have to interview the person that you're complaining against. And then we have to come up with judgment on.
Well, then you could investigate.
Investigate. So we're basically doing that. Correct?
Yeah, yes, generally speaking, rather than John Bloomer again, overview that is correct. But I also think Senator Clarkson is sort of correct that the panel itself can consult other sources.
Yeah.
Whether or not they would or how they would, but they have that ability to make the decision themselves on a case by case. It's not being imposed upon them by a statute. Which, I mean, I'll make a couple comments afterward, which is bigger distinction. So when Senator Clarkson says they have a right to do it, they have a right to do it even if H1 is passed.
Correct.
There's a distinction.
Is that finally sort of correct?
No, yeah, well,
Okay.
I'm gonna pay for that for. It's coming.
John, I love you.
No. So as I would say in this committee, when you're talking about a constitutional issue, you gotta take it from the top
Oh, my gosh.
because the Constitution always controls.
Right.
But federal law does not control separation of powers in this state. So you put this down.
As she says on page 3.
Thank you.
Oh, my God.
What controls the operation of our state government is this beautiful document, the Vermont Constitution. It controls how we operate as a state government, and all power in our state government flows from the Vermont Constitution. It's the fundamental charter of our state. It stands above legislative and judge-made law. It's the people's document. And in our Vermont Constitution, Chapter 2, Section 5 requires that there be a separation of powers, as you have heard about this. It provides that the three branches, the three departments, as it's called, shall be separate and distinct so that neither exercise the powers properly belonging to the others. And briefly stated, our Vermont Supreme Court has said the legislative power is the one that formulates and enacts laws. The executive power enforces them. And the judicial power interprets and applies them. And separating these powers is a fundamental principle that serves to create a governmental structure resistant to the forces of tyranny. So how I would like to think about it in this committee is like, this is the core, this is our hub. And the three branches are the spokes that come off of it. And we just keep moving forward, keeping each other in check, steamrolling over tyranny.
We only wish this to
I can see me with them, these ladies putting a shock collar on me sometime.
Oh, no. So to understand the requirements of our constitutional structure of our state government, we turn to the Supreme Court of Vermont and its case law, because in the checks and balances built into the separation of powers among the three branches, it's the province of the court to decide whether Vermont's laws comply with the Constitution. It's the function of the courts to maintain constitutional government. And the Supreme Court of Vermont is the final interpreter of the Vermont Constitution. So everything that's in this memo, my whole understanding of our state governmental structure comes from the Vermont Supreme Court and my reading of their case law. So that's where originally the concern raised in H1. That's why it's being addressed to you now. So what are these powers that are impacted by the last year's 2024 Act 171, Section 9? Well, one of them is each legislative chamber's authority to judge member qualifications. We each have it. It's in Section 14 for the House, and it's in Section 19 for the Senate. Each chamber has the power to judge member qualifications. And so in the 2001 Supreme Court of Vermont Brady v. Dean, the SCOV, which is the initials I'll use for the Supreme Court of Vermont, acknowledged that our Constitution does not define, nor have we previously addressed the precise scope of the legislative prerogative over members' qualifications, but held that this exclusive constitutional prerogative encompasses or surrounds the authority to determine whether a member's personal or pecuniary interest requires disqualification from voting on a question before it. The court said, we further conclude that as a policy matter, a proper regard for the independence of the legislature requires that we respect its members' personal judgments concerning their participation in matters before them. And a member's decision to vote on a matter before the House represents, in our view, a core legislative function that must remain inviolate to ensure the continued integrity and independence of that institution. And so the Senate enjoys that exclusive authority. In other words, what our court was saying in Brady v. Dean is that it was confirming that each chamber's constitutional authority to judge member qualifications at a minimum means that each chamber is exclusively responsible for determining whether one of its members has a conflict in voting, and by the Vermont Constitution, no other entity can make that determination. So the 2001 Brady v. Dean case is the last known time that the SCOV adjudicated the meaning of that Section 14. We have a couple other cases that I've cited in Section 17, but they are not as on point as Brady v. Dean. But Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure and federal case law and that of multiple other states indicates that the breadth of each chamber's authority to regulate the conduct of its members in the exercise of judging member qualifications is practically unlimited, as an inherent power of self-protection in order to uphold chamber integrity. And it's not just limited to regulating core legislative functions. It can be anything, any conduct that the chamber thinks impacts the integrity of the chamber, because when the public loses faith in the integrity of a chamber, our whole legislative or our whole government can start to crumble, and we lose faith in our governmental structures. And so we know from case law that courts can review legislative discipline in this exercise of constitutional authority if it violates legislators' First Amendment speech rights or basic due process. And our Constitution does say that the chambers are prohibited from expelling a member for causes known to their constituents antecedent to their election, although we have no before their election.
Okay.
Although we have no case law on that, what that means or what the scope of that is. But otherwise, there's no known case law that places limits on the type of legislative conduct that can be disciplined. None. So each chamber can regulate the core and non-core legislative conduct of its members. And that means any state code of ethics violation, allegedly committed by a legislator. Our state code of ethics is set forth in statute. Any alleged violation of the code of ethics may subject that legislator to discipline by the legislator's chamber. However, as described in Brady v. Dean, the commission, the State Ethics Commission, is prohibited by the Vermont Constitution from attempting to regulate alleged conduct of a legislator that obtains through a conflict with voting, and as described in other case law, other core legislative functions.
Senator White.
So I've been trying to figure out kind of the point of all of this.
Mhm.
And one of my main concerns that seems to be the most like bad scenario playing out is the executive branch is who controls this the Ethics Commission. They themselves, what you're saying is that they can't be proposing to have changes to our ethics standard as senators. That makes sense to me. Because I'm reading the Brady v. Dean thing, and it seems like basically they did something bad. People said it was bad, but the legislature didn't really discipline any of these folks. So they're saying you should have disciplined these folks, or there needs to be discipline done. And I can see in a really bad scenario, if an executive branch authority really manipulates what the term ethical means and then requires things of the legislative branch, like maybe they think it's actually unethical to be protesting as a legislator, or you know what I'm saying? Like there's extremes that the executive branch, like we've seen federal requirements saying you can't introduce legislation on ICE in certain, like you can't introduce pro-immigrant legislation in some states. I guess I'm just trying to think like, so is the main concern that the executive branch could have different ethical standards than the Senate or the House, and then they could be imposing those requirements on senators or House members, and it could be like a McCarthy kind of situation where people are, is that like the worst case scenario? Or is this just that people, because this seems like that could be a really bad situation.
It's in the executive branch, it's just the State Ethics Commission, which is in this memo, get into who they are, but it's 7 members appointed by 7 different entities, and most of them are from private organizations, and they have the power to accept complaints regarding the state code of ethics, which is set forth in statute. It contains multiple provisions regarding prohibitions on directing unethical conduct, the appearance of unethical conduct, preferential treatment, misusing your position or information, misuse of government resources, gifts, and a few other things is in the state code of ethics. And the issue is that some of the provisions of the state code of ethics, like the acceptance of gifts is not a core legislative function. And like getting gifts is not part of being a legislator. So it's completely legitimate that we would have a statute that says, enacted by the legislature, these are permissible gifts that you can receive. But when it comes to conflicts, the commission, our Vermont Supreme Court held in Brady v. Dean that voting, yes. And another case said disclosures, because disclosures relate to whether you have a conflict in voting. That can't be regulated by any entity other than the chamber itself because of that exclusive authority over core legislative functions. So core legislative functions are anything that relate to what you're doing here as a legislator, voting, debate,
drafting legislation.
Yes, whether you should introduce legislation, what committee you serve on.
Okay.
Nobody's business but your own chambers. And so one of the things that I is addressed in this memo is that this time we don't know where the commission understands the line to be between core and non-core legislative duties, which is another flag, but it's not addressed in H1 because H1 is really focused on this consultation requirement.
Okay, so there's no risk of us. That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting. It's very.
I don't know whether this is going to help distill this. I'm hoping it can. You know how I like sort of imagery and
Yes.
I like to think that the 3 branches of government are much like silos, which is not always a bad word. We don't like it in terms of agencies cooperating with each other. But let's say this is the legislative piece. Next door in the next room is the judicial, and the next one down is who am I leaving out?
Executive.
Right now, the door is closed.
Yep.
This bill is all about requiring, because we have sole constitutional authority to judge members' qualifications in the two legislative chambers. The Ethics Commission can slip something under that door and say, hey, we really think you ought to take a look at this. We haven't opened the door yet. We're not going to open the door unless we choose the panels to do that. Similarly, the judicial branch can operate the same way. The Ethics Commission can refer or slip something under the door, and same with the executive session. But nowhere should there be a requirement that that door be opened. And before we even consider it, to take any sort of testimony. Does that help?
That does help a lot.
That's the separation
That is
of powers.
wonderful. And I guess what you're
That's
saying
great.
is like you also think that the scope of what the commission could review, they might not have clear boundaries when they're doing those things versus what we as a panel might do
Yes.
because we look at those things specifically. Interesting.
That's what I mean by separation of powers.
Yeah. And
I mean, they may have clear boundaries. I mean, the ethics commission is strong. It just, they're not gonna do this unless we ask them for their.
if we do, yeah. Thank you.
That is so wonderful. I really like that. And it ties into the last point on this page is that if H1 is enacted in the law, it's gonna help. I know it will help the House Ethics Panel for the commission to specify in advance when it refers to a complaint, the application of the state code of ethics to the facts presented in the complaint, so that the panel can better understand the commission's interpretation of the code of ethics and then determine whether it needs to follow up with the commission on whether this was a permissible gift or whether was this a misuse of position.
Exactly, because I mean, the ethics commission could conceivably, particularly if we ever give them more staff, could be a very useful partner with us on much of this.
And we have, and at the end of this memo, I provide examples of how the House Ethics Panel is already turning to them as a resource.
Exactly.
So the other issue that is raised by last year's ethics bill was that each chamber controls its own procedure. Statute does not control legislative procedure. So in addition to H1 addressing the constitutional authority of each chamber to judge member qualifications, H1, this year's H1, also addresses the issue that statute can't control our legislative procedure, and statute enacted by one General Assembly cannot bind a future General Assembly because you have a continuing power to administer your own legislative procedure. So to put another way, H1 will correct 2024 Act 171, Section 9's attempt to control by statute each chamber's constitutional legislative procedural authority. And why is that the case? It's because the General Assembly's legislative power is only limited by the Vermont Constitution. The Constitution is not a limit on its powers, is a limit on its powers. It's not a grant of power. The legislature's power is practically absolute except for constitutional limitations. And legislative rulemaking is a necessary legislative power. Think about us in the House. There's 150 members. How do we get anything done without legislative rules procedure? I won't speak to the Senate. You have 30 people, but you also, I'm sure, need legislative procedure to get your things done. That's why you need your Senate secretary. It's true. And everybody's writing rules. So while legislative procedure must comply with constitutional requirements, like your quorum requirements, when a roll call is required, the vote threshold or override of veto, all that's set forth in the Constitution, legislative procedural authority is otherwise unlimited. If it's not specified in here, it's up to you to decide what it is. And this is stated in multiple cases. We don't have any known Vermont Supreme Court case law that addresses the constitutional limits of our Vermont legislative procedure, but there's a robust case law on this in other states. So I won't go into, in the interest of time, Mr. Chair, I just want to go over the high parts of this portion of the memo, but basically legislative procedure involves anything that relates to how the legislative chamber conducts its business. Oopsie, lost mine. Sorry. All right, technology.
It didn't even go out for us.
Wow, awesome. So you can have legislative procedures set forth in statute, and you can follow it if it's set forth in statute, but statute exists only after concurrence with the other chamber and after a bill has been presented to the governor pursuant to the Vermont Constitution, because the governor is a necessary part of our legislation. But neither the governor nor the other chamber has the authority to control a chamber's procedure. As I like to say, so they're constitutional business. So whenever possible, legislative procedure should not be set forth in statute, but that's what happened in last year's ethics bill. Moreover, the principle that constitutionally permitted legislative rules and procedure supersedes statute is proclaimed multiple times in Mason's manual. And while we don't have any known Vermont Supreme Court case law on this either, the fact that courts will not adjudicate challenges to constitutionally permitted legislative procedure, even if it conflicts with statute, is supported by case law and not only the U.S. Supreme Court, but multiple other states' Supreme Courts. So courts, I'm just going to do a high-level go-through of this language. Courts are not going to adjudicate challenges to constitutional legislative rules or the violation thereof, even if it's set forth in statute, because you have a continuing power to set your own rules and even violate your own rules. And it's your ability to do so if you choose to do so as a chamber. So think about germaneness, for example. You have a germaneness rule, but sometimes the chamber is in agreement that it's politically expedient to add a non-germane amendment to a bill. There might be reasons to do so. So even though you have a rule prohibiting non-germane amendments, you can allow amendments to go through that might not relate to the bill. That's one example.
By vote.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Suspending.
No, actually, that and the fact that nobody objects is.
Oh, right. Nobody
But you can
objects.
also do it by vote.
It's an-
Yeah.
We can do it by vote, or we can do it if nobody objects.
And I'll go through here, this other portion of the memo is describing that even if legislative procedure is set forth in statute, it does not control the chamber's procedure because the chamber has the authority to change its procedure at any time. It's up to the chamber to decide what its procedure is.
Ooh, how rogue.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through, so I don't want to take up the secretary's time. But if you have time to read this later, provides multiple citations to case law that describe that legislative procedure cannot be controlled by statute. But that's what Section 9 of last year's ethics bill attempted to do. It attempted to control by statute the legislative procedure of each chamber by attempting to require the chamber's ethics panels to consult with the commission on a complaint. The commission refers to them for the panels to make a determination on the complaint. But statute can't control constitutional legislative authority. And H1 would resolve this issue by shifting the consultation requirement to the commission, which is created by statute and may be controlled by statute. So I'll just note here, I provided here the citation to the constitutional provisions that relate to the Vermont Supreme Court's exclusive disciplinary authority over judicial officers and attorneys, but you already heard from the judicial branch and they are more than capable of speaking for themselves, so I won't belabor the point here. But let me just give you an overview of what the Vermont State Ethics Commission is and what it does. So the commission comprises 7 members appointed by 7 different entities and it elects its own chair. So let's take a look just for reference, as a reminder, who is the State Ethics Commission? Well, the Vermont Supreme Court Chief Justice appoints 1 member, and the other members are appointed by the League of Women Voters, the Board of Directors of Vermont Society of Certified Public Accountants, the Board of Managers of the Vermont Bar Association, the Board of Directors of the Human Resources Management, Vermont State Council, and the Speaker and the Committee on Committees all each appoint 1 member who's supposed to be a former municipal officer that was added in last year's bill because you
Added municipal
there
ethics.
you go. So that's who they are. And I would just note here, it's interesting listening to the testimony that's been happening on this bill and about some of the concerns, why the commission was created. I just want to let's take a step back and think about who we are in the House, me in the House. Who is the House? It's 150 members directly elected by their representative, by their voters. 1 person, 1 vote. It's Vermonters' direct representatives. That's the House. Who's the House Ethics Panel? The House Ethics Panel is 5 members that always has a varied political representation. Right now, it's 2 Ds, 2 Rs, and a P. Who are they appointed by? They're appointed by the House Rules Committee. Who's the House Rules Committee? The Speaker, who's elected by the House, the Majority Leader, the Assistant Majority Leader, and an at-large member elected by the Majority Party, the Minority Leader, the Assistant Minority Leader, and an at-large member elected by the Minority Party. So, in my opinion, the Ethics Panel is directly from the voters, and you are accountable to the voters. Versus the Ethics Commission is answerable only to itself. Why do I say that? It's an independent commission because the commission members can only be removed by the other commission members.
Right, which is was intention. Made it very independent. Needed it.
And it's in the executive branch. It says that in statute. But that is only in statute as clarifying language. I know because I wrote it. The commission would be in the executive branch regardless of whether that provision of enabling law were there or not. And I'm just mentioning that because as we've been discussing this bill, the commission provided testimony to the Online House Government Operations Committee, saying that it's not of the executive branch, which was confusing for me to understand why that was stated. And I'm just stating here, it's in the executive branch, it's independent because the commission members can remove themselves.
And they're appointed by, other than the two, they're appointed by the governor.
No,
No governor appointees.
they are not.
So, okay,
And she
okay.
just went through that group.
Yeah,
But they're housed in the executive, but they are an independent.
right.
So it's.
But like so the league, okay, I see. So it's not a person, so the League of Women Voters themselves picks the person. It's not the governor picks someone from the league.
Right, right.
Oh.
Yeah.
And their human resources person would be a human resources person from the executive branch. No, it's not it's not,
No,
the Digi.
no, there's a whole
Oh.
association of human resource people.
Okay,
It's from that private entity.
okay. Well, that's not even, okay.
So
But
it's
they
just
live-
housed, it's an independent commission, but it needs a place to live in the government. And it's so it's housed in the executive, right? Just the way they.
But they would review commissioners and secretaries. Like if there was an ethics complaint against a staff member of the executive branch, they would go through this.
If a person submitted a complaint to the commission,
Yes.
and then the commission by statute refers it based on the subject matter of the complaint. So if it involved an allegation that an executive branch employee violated the Department of Human Resources Personnel Manual, then it would get referred to the Department of Human Resources.
Ah, okay.
However,
That is
Senator-
different than, okay.
However, what this memo will get into is starting later this year, the commission has the authority to investigate on its own.
Right.
Oh.
Which. Yes,
Which is unconstitutional.
Different bill.
that's a different bill. That's not in this.
The different, yeah, it's not addressed in H1.
We're in deep waters, okay.
We made a mess.
Well,
I didn't do the bill on the floor.
but we needed to put teeth. I mean, this is a big conversation because they also needed some teeth.
So I'll go into, I'm on page 11 here. As it was originally created, as you were just describing, Senator Clarkson, the Ethics Commission did not have investigative or enforcement authority. It was just a place where the public knew they existed, and there's a place to track complaints and refer them to the applicable entity that would normally handle them. And in the case of the legislative and judicial branches, request a report back. But in last year's ethics bill, that bill provided the commission with the authority to investigate, subpoena, hold hearings, issue warnings and reprimands, and recommended actions in regard to complaints effective September 1st of this year. On that date, the commission can investigate after receiving a complaint or it can investigate on its own initiative. And I will just mention here, as I was following this bill, that on the record in House GovOps, the commission testified that's not enforcement authority. But as the Vermont Supreme Court noted in a case involving municipalities' censure of a member, you have the authority to reprimand. Reprimand is a form of discipline. It's a form of discipline that an organization can undertake. Censure is a form of reprimand. It's defined as the formal resolution of a legislative, administrative, or other body reprimanding a person, normally one of its own members, for specified conduct. And so for reference, warnings and reprimands are also one of the disciplinary powers that other entities in the state use to discipline individuals within their regulatory control. For example, House Ethics Panel has the authority to warn. So does the Judicial Conduct Board. OPR, which regulates how many licensees now,
Yes.
over 50 types of professionals.
Yeah.
They have the authority to issue warnings and reprimands. So does our criminal justice council. Is warning and reprimands are one of the options in disciplining. And I would just ask you members, if you had a complaint against you that the commission was investigating and your documents were subpoenaed and your attendance was subpoenaed at a hearing that was open to the public, and the commission charged you with allegations of unethical conduct, and you had to hire an attorney because there is the commission, the language of the commission provides that their proceedings are conducted in accordance with Vermont rules of civil procedure and rules of evidence. And then the commission is able to issue a warning or a reprimand, providing that you violated the code of ethics. Whether you think that is enforcement authority. My perspective, I think that's enforcement authority.
Yeah.
So I want to point that out because as I've been following the bill through the process, it's just interesting to me about how the current law is interpreted. So what I just provided was
So, it sounds like your feeling is that they are interpreting it as inadequate, when in fact they actually have more, that we've given them more than they seem to recognize or think is
Or it's
necessary.
convenient for them to say it's not enforcement so that, yeah.
Is that fair, Nancy?
yes.
There's, I'll say a couple comments from you, but they're saying it's unenforceable because they know it's unconstitutional. If they had, because if they have enforcement power, it's unconstitutional.
Well, they have the ability to issue warnings and reprimands,
It's unconstitutional.
for things that are not for legislative duties, like gifts or misusing your position. They would have that authority to discipline a legislator for that.
But they do not have it for your voting. They can't recommend that you be taken out of the committee. The way this is written is, in my opinion, very broad.
So what I did, why this memo is so long, is I provided in attachment A, some of the statutory provisions that will provide this new commission investigative and enforcement authority that's set to take effect on September 1st of this year pursuant to last year's ethics bill. I did want to note here, though, just on this topic, that while H 875 from last year is introduced, would have provided the commission in section 17 with the new position of a full-time legal counsel to assist the commission with these new powers, in addition to the municipal ethics provisions that also are included in the bill. That position and its related appropriation were deleted from the final version of the bill before it passed the General Assembly. So therefore, at this time, the commission has no legal staff to assist the commission to administer these new functions that involve the interpretation and an application of the law, which is flat.
Yeah.
The commission has an executive director. The General Assembly has not provided the funding to make it beyond a part-time position. And statute does not require, nor is the executive director required to be an attorney. So the commission now, upcoming in September 1 of this year, has this investigative and enforcement authority, but does not have the legal staff to support it.
Correct.
The commission does have in statute the authority to appoint outside legal counsel and investigators, but it's up to you in the legislature to provide them with the appropriation to support that.
Right.
And my understanding is you have not.
Yeah.
So what this new enforcement authority does, it will include the power to enforce the state code of ethics, which is set forth in a subchapter of the ethics chapter. And while, as I was saying earlier, while one provision of the statutory law provides that the code of ethics does not in any way abrogate or alter the sole authority of each house of the General Assembly to judge the elections and qualifications of its members, it's to be determined at this time how the commission views the scope of its investigative and enforcement authority in regard to legislative
This
conduct.
is a big issue.
So right now, specifically, it's unknown at this time what the commission perceives to be core legislative functions constitutionally committed to each chamber, like conflicts and interest in voting, discuss and Brady, versus non-core legislative functions that the commission may permissibly regulate under the Constitution. We just don't know because it's new authority. So that's why it will be helpful in H1, if you enact it, that the commission will be providing this advice on the application of the state code of ethics upfront.
That's the beginning.
It will provide us with more information on how they interpret the state code of ethics. But what they do with it, unknown, because you've also provided with them with the authority to investigate on their own without receiving a complaint. So here, I don't want to take up the secretary's time. I just provided some interaction between the commission and the House Ethics Panel, which is what I can speak to. As noted before, when the commission refers a complaint to either the panels, the language purposefully in statute says the commission requests a report back. Requests, unlike when it refers complaints to the AG's office, for example, or the state's attorneys, they're required to report back. Requesting a report back was purposeful because it acknowledges the constitutional legislative procedural authorities of the two chambers. So for the House, when we get a complaint, when the House Ethics Panel gets a complaint from the commission, the House Ethics Panel fulfills that request to report back on the final disposition of the complaint by providing the commission with a copy of the closure report that's provided the complainant and respondent. There's another provision of statutory law that requires the panel to submit code of ethics trainings to the commission in advance of the training. And the House Ethics Panel has performed that function by providing its training PowerPoints to the commission for its review about the state code of ethics. And we have invited the commission to participate in our House Ethics Panel training.
Oh, nice.
Also, the panel, House Ethics Panel or its staff will refer representatives to the commission on matters that pertain to the acceptance of gifts or other non-core legislative duties. And again, I'll note here that we'll say to the representative, when you contact the commission, if you're willing, will you please let us know what they say so that we can better understand the application of the state code of ethics. And then finally, I'll note there's another provision of statutory law that requires a new commission reporting requirement. And it did contain a requirement for the panel, House Ethics Panel, to report to the commission aggregate data on ethics complaints with complaints separated by topic and the disposition. At first, when we became aware of this statutory requirement during 2024 adjournment, that did raise a flag because technically that would violate the House Ethics Panel confidentiality requirements. However, after consulting with the commission, the House Ethics Panel actually revised its procedures so it can discuss topics. And it was helpful to discuss with the commission what it was seeking and the reason for doing so. And so the House Ethics Panel revised its procedures to be able to describe complaint topics to the commission. And actually also House Ethics Panel members sponsored a House resolution that's currently in our House Rules Committee that would propose amendments to our House Ethics Rule to address this and other matters relating to the disclosure of complaint information that the House Ethics Panel receives. So
Yeah, how much is aggregate data? Is it like, because I feel like we don't get that many complaints, so it's really like you could pretty quickly figure out who it was. What is aggregate, like more than 10?
Senate posts this on your website every 2 years, all the ethics complaints, that's what we provide over. On the left-hand side of the committee page, there's the last 2 reports. And so probably, I can't remember, there were 3 or 4 in the last biennium. Well, so it'll be there Sunday.
So,
Oh,
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, we're at 4:00.
And by our rules, only required.
I've taken up an hour of your time. I'm so sorry. If you need, while you're considering this bill, at the end of this memo, the attachment A provides some of the provisions of statute in regard to the new investigative and enforcement authority. And I've highlighted some provisions that relate to that subpoena authority and commission hearings that I described. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be back. I'm sorry I took up so much of your
That's
time.
okay.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Secretary. Also, for taking up our time.
Sure.
That was great.
Nobody will believe I can.
Very thorough.
5 minutes.
I have a quick question about the House resolution to
Yes.
amend the ethics rules.
Yes.
Hey, oh, it's linked right in there.
Yeah.
I'll take a look at it then.
Yeah.
Because I actually think there might be use, and I've said this to Secretary Blumer before, in potentially amending our Senate ethics rules. So I will take a look at that. It's linked right
Awesome.
there.
Thank you.
Is that a joint resolution or just us?
Just the House
The
resolution.
House and Senate.
And vice versa.
So I will try to be very brief, and because there's two components we discussed today. Well, let me start. Betsy did a wonderful job for my position. I think she did a great job. I agree with 99.99% of what she said. That's better than Ivory Snow, which is 99.44%. And so there are really two components you've discussed today. And the second one is really the investigative powers, and I'm not going to say much about that because it's not in the current bill. If you decide to take that up, I have a lot to say. And I agree with everything that Betsy Ann said, and I think that there's a lot of conflict or potential conflict between the separation of powers. And so I'm more than willing to come back on that if your committee decides to do something with this bill or any other bill, and I believe Betsy Ann would be more than happy to come back and repeat some of that stuff. Generally speaking, I wanted to concentrate more on today on H1, and I'm going to get big kind of like at the end of the table, the chair knows. Zelda from Rutland, so I'm going to say, I used to say when I was in the Senate floor, I'm just a country lawyer, so I got to do things simple because it's the best way to be looking at things. And so generally, we have process and procedure. There's a constitution, and there's rules. And why? Because the Constitution says you set your rules. No one else can set your rules. No one else can set your procedure. No one else can say what you do or don't do. That includes not only stuff on the floor, it includes, for those of you who always wondered, the open meeting law doesn't apply to you because it can't by the Constitution. If you read that open meeting law at the very end, it says it'll apply to them pursuant to the constitutional requirements. And that's really the open meeting, open door policy and stuff, because it's a policy and a procedure. You also have an ability to do executive sessions. You've never done there's a whole series on there are doors that shut on the chamber.
Oh.
Someday I'll show you. So when you look at all that, when you look, and it's unfortunate Senator Clarkson's not here because it's really where she got it right. When you look at Professor Teachout's memo, what he missed was the rules and the procedure.
Oh, she's in there.
It's not harmful to listen when it comes, like in the beginning. Putting it in statute is telling you how your ethics committee has to function.
Yeah.
And that is unconstitutional. And so generally, when you say that the committee has to go there before they do anything, that's telling them how to do it. It's a policy, it's a procedure, it's unconstitutional, it needs to be changed. If the committee, as Senator Clarkson said, wants to talk to them, there's a whole bunch of other confidentiality stuff, how they can, but they can. That's a decision, as explained by the clerk. There's delegation, but that committee can decide sort of some of the policies and procedures. And so generally, even if you accepted Senator Teachout's argument, I think there's still some issues on a separation of power. He wasn't discussing the rules and the creation of the rules. And this statute affects what rules you use for your committee. And so it's unconstitutional just on that basis and has to be changed because it's requiring you to follow a certain procedure, which would be no different than if some outside organization by statute said you had to do something on your floor a certain. No different. And so in that sense, it's unconstitutional and has to be changed. That's the summary 5-minute version, the Rutland version, down and dirty, simple way of looking at it, because that's.
Yeah, my analogy might not have made a lot of sense, but it's how I have to sort of look at things too. I share sometimes your concern to keep things as simple as possible. We're all in this. They can shoot something under the door, but it's up to us whether we open that door.
And I think the main point of my concerns, I understand that the separation of powers thing is extremely important. It's the Constitution. I get that. That's like number one good argument. But I also don't want us to hurt the functionality of our ethics panels. And that we haven't spent a lot of time on, but I do think that it would affect the functionality of our, at least in the Senate side. So, I think that that's if the end goal of this You were getting a compliment when you're on
Couple
the road, by
times.
the way, so just so you know, you have to
I'll
line
have to go back and look at YouTube.
But it's also when are people bringing information to the ethics panel? I think it could be limiting what people bring to the Senate ethics panel if they think there's a possibility that it could be expanded to be a public scope. So I think the actual goal of more transparency could be harmed by this. Like, I understand everyone's making the separation of powers argument. I also think functionally this could be creating less transparency rather than creating more, because fewer people who have a process where they're not wanting that information to be public may end up in a situation where it is public. If that is a
Your
clear.
Senate rules, your Senate ethics rules and regulations, and your sexual harassment rules and
Yeah.
regulations. What I call a victim or reporter kind of preference as to how much is public or not.
Yeah,
And so that's really what you're arguing. That was
Yes.
made a decision about 8 or 10 years ago for both of them. It's you as a senator are more restricted on what you can go to the public on, and either one of those, if you're subject to either one of those. But a victim or a reporter can go to the public straight. They do not have to go to the ethics or the sexual harassment panel. And that's the reason because I was here, we did most of this. They were created that way so the person reporting has sort of a better input and better control in making sure it's addressed.
yeah, exactly.
Senator Yoshi.
I hear your point, but I think at the end of the day, the sort of conversations about how this might impact that behavior or this behavior is sort of irrelevant and moot, given the unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Like that's, as the clerk pointed out, that rules, like the rest of it is irrelevant if the Constitution says no.
I could agree.
But sorry, I agree with both of you, so I want to get everybody, but because you can decide how open it is by your rules and regulations. Once you limit and get it back in within the Constitution, then you can decide who drives that
Yeah.
bus. And right now, the Senate has decided that the victim or reporter sort of drives the bus on the confidentiality. And that was your decision and former people that sat in this room and on this floor. That's not being put in from somebody outside or by statute or by the Ethics Commission.
The other piece too, that you have both raised is that there's another aspect of this law that goes into effect September 1st that is also constitutionally problematic that I think we should consider addressing in H1 in our time with it. I don't think we should let it go into effect if it is in fact unconstitutional, which is what I hear being said.
Well, we've got it on the calendar again for Friday. Christine Sibbert will come in. And I had planned, I think you and I, when we did our agenda planning for next week, we'll have some sort of vote or resolution on this next week. And again, we'll be looking for some counsel as to whether to just pass H1 as it came across or whether to repeal last year's act, which might be another way.
There was a lot of good in there.
There's a bunch, we're just gonna, yeah. I think
I hope that's not enough.
there were a couple, you guys can do whatever you want, you're the Senate. There are other things or other provisions in there which should also be looked at before you repeal the whole thing, because there are some people who believe that some of it was good, but there are just a couple, these are the two we've highlighted.
We can
that are
change
unconstitutional.
things, but we don't, I would not
Okay.
recommend we
I
repeal
guess-
that.
Mr.
Yeah,
Chair,
yeah.
The other thing was, Chair, if you are looking for additional testimony on that aspect, as I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty certain Betsy Ann will come back, and I'm willing to come back and provide similar testimony or an elaboration on why it's unconstitutional if you are going down that avenue, if you want more testimony or a bigger basis for why there's a problem. And I will also tell you, I think, I may be wrong on this, that Peter Teachout might agree or should be agreeing that that's a problem for at least the core functions. That there's a core, that there is a. I just think that
You mean the
I don't
additional
think
things?
yes, I don't
That's
think,
it.
there should not be a disagreement about imposing penalties or sanctions by the Ethics Commission for core functions. If they're imposing things for core functions or investigating it, I don't know, I haven't heard anyone ever say that that's not unconstitutional in some sense.
Well, we don't have to take a vote next week, but I just wanted to let you know we will be hearing from the commission on Friday. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Wow, yeah, this was a lot of work.
Well,
Get to go
an
home.
update for what I did for the house too.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's terrific. Have you, I mean, I'm just curious, have you talked to Peter?
Not recently, but I'm happy to talk with them further. I always enjoy talking with different things. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you to the committee for paying attention and staying with us. It was a long afternoon, but
It's good.
let's be honest, people pay a lot of money to have courses in this regard.
Literally.
Okay, so we are very fortunate to have two representatives of each chamber to share their knowledge with us. And,
Well, they each pay a lot of money for those.
well,
courses.
yeah, they're sharing that money, they're sharing that knowledge.
Bring it on.
And we are very grateful.
Amen.
Thank you both.
So we'll call it a day and see you all.